I was 30 years old the day my mother stood in the middle of our Miami patio and told 20 of our relatives that I was a thief. It was a standard Sunday afternoon gathering. The air was thick with Florida humidity and the scent of roasting citrus and charcoal. I was holding a heavy silver tray of iced tea, the condensation dripping steadily onto my bare arms. My name is Lauren Rodriguez, and I appraise luxury coastal real estate for a living. I walk into million-dollar waterfront properties and figure out what they are actually worth underneath the fresh paint and expensive staging. I spot cracks in the foundation, but I never saw the crack in my own family until that afternoon. Welcome to QR Told Stories, the channel where the truth always outlasts the lie. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and realized you were entirely alone, stay with me today. Drop a comment with your age and let me know where you are listening from. The music cut out. My mother Patricia was standing by the sliding glass doors, tapping a silver spoon against her sangria glass. She held a thick manila folder pressed tight against her chest. Her shoulders shook with a practiced rhythmic heave. She scanned the faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins lounging by the pool. "I did not want to bring this up today," she choked out, her voice engineered to break at the perfect moment. "But the estate, Abuela Rosa's trust, it is gone." A collective gasp swept across the patio. Abuela Rosa had passed away 6 months earlier. She left behind a $450,000 legacy, a lifetime of saving meant to secure the next generation. My stomach plummeted. I took a step forward, my instincts urging me to comfort the woman who raised me. Then she raised her hand and pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Lauren drained the accounts," she declared. Her voice carried over the still water of the pool, sharp and steady. "We have the bank ledgers." The tray of iced tea in my hand suddenly felt like it was made of lead. The ice clinked against the glass pitchers, the sound deafening in the sudden quiet of the yard. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, foreign to my own ears. Patricia wiped a single calculated tear from her cheek. As she lowered her hand, the bright afternoon sun caught a brilliant flash of stones on her wrist. A vintage diamond tennis bracelet sparkled against her skin. Just an hour earlier, she had paraded that exact piece of jewelry around the yard, telling everyone it was an early anniversary gift from my father. My father Hector stepped up beside her. He draped a heavy arm over her shoulders, pulling her close. His face was a mask of profound, manufactured disappointment. "We trusted you, Lauren," he murmured. I did not want to believe my own daughter could do something like this. I took another step toward them. The heat radiating from the pool deck was suffocating. "Dad," I said, looking for any sign of the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike. "You know I would never touch Abuela's money. You know me." He refused to meet my eyes. He just shook his head and pulled my mother closer. The silence from the rest of the family was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I looked from my mother to my father. My professional training kicked in, the part of my brain that evaluates structural integrity. The math was wrong. The emotion was wrong. You do not discover a $500,000 theft and wait until the potato salad is served to announce it to the extended family. You call the police. You call a lawyer. You do not host a barbecue. The shift in the atmosphere happened in a heartbeat. Aunt Rosora, who had kissed my cheek and praised my recent promotion just 10 minutes prior, crossed her arms and stared at the concrete patio. My older brother Brandon stood near the grill. He did not look surprised. He took a slow sip of his beer and watched me with a blank, unreadable expression. My cousins took subtle steps backward. They put physical distance between us as if I carried a disease. I looked around the yard, searching the crowd for a single face that held a shred of doubt. I found none. In their eyes, the trial was already over. My family had spent my entire life bailing out Brandon while treating my financial independence like a character flaw. I realized then that they did not just believe I was guilty, They were relieved to have a reason to finally cast me out. I did not scream. I did not beg for them to listen. I set the silver tray of drinks on the nearest wrought iron table. The glass clinked against the metal. It was the only sound left in the yard. I turned and walked out the side gate, leaving behind the house I grew up in. The wrought iron gate latched behind me with a heavy, final click. The drive back to my Fort Lauderdale condo is a blur of highway lines and blinding sun. The air conditioning in my car blasted against my face, but I was sweating. My knuckles gripped the steering wheel so tight my hands went numb. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My brain raced, desperately trying to find a logical explanation. A clerical error. A hacked account. Maybe the bank made a mistake. But the image of my mother standing on that patio kept flashing in my mind. Her tears had not been a reaction to a sudden, devastating discovery. It was an ambush. She came armed with papers. She wore her expensive new diamonds. She had prepared that speech and delivered it to an audience she specifically gathered for the occasion. My phone sat in the cup holder, a dark, silent rectangle. Not a single person called to ask for my side of the story. Not one. As I pulled into my dark parking garage, the initial shock receded. It left behind a cold, sharp realization. My own parents were framing me for a federal crime. I turned off the ignition, sitting in the silence of my car. I thought about Abuela Rosa. I remembered walking through the Central Florida citrus groves with her when I was little. She used to hold my hand and tell me to build my life on bedrock, because the rest of the family built their lives on sand. She knew. Even back then, she knew what they were capable of. I took a deep breath, the stale air of the garage filling my lungs. I was alone, targeted by the people who were supposed to protect me. And I had to figure out how they stole the money before they sent me to prison. Monday morning arrived with a suffocating silence. My Fort Lauderdale condo usually woke up to the buzzing of the family group chat. Recipes exchanged, photos of my cousin's kids, passive-aggressive reminders about upcoming birthdays. Today, the screen remained blank. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at my coffee mug, tracing the ceramic rim with a shaking finger. The air conditioning hummed a steady, monotonous tune, amplifying the quiet isolation of my apartment. I had spent the entire night replaying the barbecue in my head, searching for a sign, a slip of the tongue, anything that could explain why my mother orchestrated that performance. I picked up my phone and opened Aunt Rosora's contact. Rosora was the anchor of the Rodriguez family. Whenever my parents poured all their resources and affection into my older brother, Rosora was the one who showed up for me. She attended my high school graduation when my parents were too busy touring a college campus with Brandon. She sent me care packages during my grueling appraisal licensing exams. If anyone would listen to reason, it was her. I tapped the green call button. The line rang half a time before dropping into an automated voicemail message. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen. I tried again. Half a ring. Voicemail. I sent a text. It immediately returned an undelivered notification. Rosora had blocked me. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow. The psychological warfare had officially begun. My parents had not just accused me. They had mobilized the entire extended family overnight, creating a solid wall of exclusion. They knew isolation would break me faster than anger. Growing up, independence was my shield. While my parents remortgaged their house to pay for Brandon's lavish wedding and his string of failed startup companies, I worked 2 jobs to pay my own tuition. I earned my real estate appraisal license through sheer grit. I built my life outside their shadow. Now, they were using that independence against me, painting it as greed. They were spinning my success as evidence of a crime. But the smear campaign did not stop at the family borders. Miami operates like a small town wearing the clothes of a sprawling metropolis. The luxury real estate network is tight-knit, multicultural, and incredibly prone to gossip. A whisper at a Sunday barbecue in Coral Gables reaches the high-rise offices on Brickell Avenue by Tuesday morning. Word travels fast when reputations are tied to millions of dollars. I was scheduled to appraise a $20 million commercial property that week. It was a career-defining contract for a prominent international developer named Diego Suarez. Diego needed a meticulous valuation for a waterfront hotel acquisition. I had spent 3 weeks prepping the preliminary reports, pulling zoning laws and running comparative market analyses. At 10 in the morning, my phone finally rang. It was not my family. It was Diego's executive assistant, Ms. Rodriguez, the assistant said, her tone clipped and professional. Mr. Suarez is canceling the appraisal contract for the South Beach property. I stood up from the kitchen stool, my pulse quickening. Canceling? I asked. We are set to walk the property tomorrow. Did he find another firm? Mr. Suarez has decided to go in a different direction, she replied, her voice cooling by several degrees. He mentioned a recent development regarding a conflict of character. We require an appraiser with an unblemished ethical standing. The firm will mail a check for your preliminary hours. Please do not contact this office again. The line went dead. The phone slipped from my grip and clattered onto the quartz countertop. Conflict of character. My mother had not just cried to my aunts and uncles. Someone in that yard had talked to their broker, who talked to a developer, who talked to Diego Suarez. My parents were bleeding out my reputation in the exact industry I relied on to survive. Without my ethical standing, my appraisal license was worthless. I would lose my business, my condo, and my ability to feed myself. The family dispute had mutated into a targeted strike on my livelihood. The ground beneath my feet was crumbling. I could not sit in that silent apartment for another second. I grabbed my car keys and practically ran down to the parking garage. I did not have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to escape the suffocating walls of my own ruin. I drove south on Interstate 95, the blinding Florida sun glaring off the windshield. Traffic crawled as I entered Miami-Dade County. Almost on autopilot, I found myself navigating the tree-lined streets of Coral Gables, the wealthy enclave where my older brother Brandon recently opened his latest venture. It was a boutique fitness center, high-intensity interval training for wealthy socialites. Brandon had pitched it to the family a year ago as the next big franchise. I pulled my sedan to the curb across the street from the sleek, glass-fronted building. The neon sign glowed against the bright afternoon sky. It was prime workout hour, right when the lunch crowd should be packing the studio. I rolled down my window, letting the humid air wash over my face. I squinted at the building. The expansive parking lot was a ghost town. Only 2 cars sat on the freshly paved asphalt. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see pristine, unused rows of treadmills and weight racks. The place was deserted. It looked like a showroom, not a functioning business. Yet, parked directly in front of the main entrance, shining under the Florida sun, was a custom, slate-gray Porsche 911. It was Brandon's car. He had posted it all over social media last month, bragging about his entrepreneurial success. I stared at the vehicle, the appraiser inside my brain snapping to attention. The numbers began to run through my head. The lease on a commercial space in this zip code would run at least $20,000 a month. The equipment inside cost 6 figures. The insurance alone would be astronomical. And the Porsche was another $150,000. The parking lot was empty. The gym had no clients. The math did not add up. My brother was operating a failing business, bleeding cash by the day, yet he was driving a luxury sports car and wearing custom suits. Where was the capital coming from? A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. Abuela Rosa's trust had held $450,000. The exact kind of capital a desperate man might need to keep up appearances when his business was quietly drowning. Brandon had always lived beyond his means, always chased the image of success rather than doing the actual work. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The panic that had been suffocating me all morning evaporated, replaced by a hardened, analytical focus. Crying would not save my career. Pleading with Aunt Rosora would not pay my mortgage. My family wanted to play a game of numbers and reputations, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. I evaluated assets for a living. I tracked market trends, uncovered hidden property damage, and followed the money trail until I found the true value of a structure. I knew how to look beneath the surface. If they wanted to accuse me of a crime, they needed proof. And so did I. I could no longer play defense. I had to go on the offensive. I drove back to Fort Lauderdale with a singular goal. I needed to see the bank ledgers my mother waved around at the barbecue. I needed to see exactly how the money moved. I needed undeniable facts. The sadness of losing my family was quickly being overshadowed by the primal instinct to survive. When I finally walked back into my condo lobby later that afternoon, the concierge waved me down. He handed me a thick, rigid envelope. It had arrived via certified mail while I was out. I looked at the return address. It was from a prominent Miami law firm, the same firm my father used for his real estate deals. The psychological warfare was over. The legal battle had just arrived on my doorstep. I took the elevator up to my floor, tearing open the cardboard tab before I even reached my door. Inside rested a formal demand letter, and pinned behind it was the very thing I had been looking for: the forged bank statements. The trap had been officially set, and I was holding the bait. I tore open the heavy cardboard envelope the moment I walked through my front door. The thick stack of papers slid out and hit my quartz countertop with a dull thud. The letterhead belonged to a prestigious Brickell Avenue law firm. My father had used them for his commercial real estate acquisitions for 20 years. The top sheet was a formal demand notice. It stated that I had 30 days to return $450,000 to the estate of Rosa Rodriguez, or the firm would initiate civil litigation and forward the matter to the state attorney. My lungs tightened as I read the legal threats. I flipped to the second page. Attached were 6 months of printed bank statements. The logo at the top belonged to Suncoast Cooperative, a mid-sized credit union with branches scattered across Miami-Dade County. I stared at the bold black ink. The account holder name printed clearly across the top right corner was Lauren Rodriguez. The address listed was a post office box in Hialeah. I do not live in Hialeah. I have never banked with Suncoast Cooperative. My primary accounts have always been with a major national bank. Yet there it was. My full legal name and my social security number printed at the bottom of the tax reporting summary. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. I traced the transaction columns with my index finger. On the 14th of October, a wire transfer arrived for the exact amount of my grandmother's life savings. 3 days later, the funds began to bleed out in untraceable cashier checks and outbound wires. By December, the balance was zero. Someone had stolen my identity to steal my inheritance. I did not bother changing out of my work clothes. I grabbed my purse, my driver's license, and my passport. I practically flew down the stairs to the parking garage. The drive from Fort Lauderdale to the nearest Suncoast Cooperative branch took 45 agonizing minutes. The afternoon traffic on Interstate 95 felt like a parking lot. My mind spun through the implications. Opening a bank account requires rigid verification. You cannot just walk into a financial institution and open a checking account in someone else's name. The federal government enacted strict Know Your Customer regulations years ago to prevent money laundering and fraud. The bank needs a physical identification card. They need a signature. They need a living, breathing person sitting in the chair. So how did my parents bypass federal law? I pulled into the credit union parking lot, the tires of my sedan squealing slightly against the hot pavement. I killed the engine and forced myself to take 3 deep breaths. Panic makes you look guilty. I needed to be cold. I needed to be an investigator. I walked through the double glass doors of the credit union. The blast of refrigerated air chilled the sweat on my forehead. The lobby was quiet, smelling of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly to the reception desk. I placed my driver's license and my passport flat on the laminate wood. I need to speak with the branch manager immediately regarding fraudulent activity on my account, I said. My voice was low but carried enough sharp authority to make the receptionist blink. She typed my name into her terminal. Her eyes widened slightly. "Miss Rodriguez," she murmured. "Let me get the manager." She retreated toward a frosted glass office in the back corner. Through the translucent pane, I watched a woman stand up from her desk. When the office door opened, the floor vanished from beneath my feet. The branch manager stepping out to greet me was Carmen Delgado. Carmen was not just a bank employee. She was my mother's oldest friend. She had attended my high school graduation. She used to bring homemade tamales to our house on Christmas Eve. My mother and Carmen had played cards together every Tuesday night for a decade. Carmen stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing in the lobby. The polite customer service smile melted right off her face, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer panic. She quickly ushered me into her office and shut the door, clicking the lock into place. "Lauren," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" I pushed the demand letter and the forged bank statements across her desk. "I am here to find out how an account was opened using my social security number without my physical presence," I said. I kept my posture rigid. I did not sit down. Carmen looked at the papers and swallowed hard. Her hands shook as she adjusted her glasses. "Your mother came in last year," she stammered, avoiding my gaze. "She told me she was setting up a surprise trust fund for you. She said your grandmother was sick and wanted to secure your future privately before she passed. She had all your documentation, your social security card, a copy of your birth certificate. I am the branch manager. I have override authority. I just approved the system alerts. I thought I was helping Patricia do something beautiful for her daughter." "You bypassed federal banking laws," I said, the reality of the situation clicking into place like the chamber of a loaded gun. "You bypassed the Know Your Customer protocols because my mother asked you a favor." Carmen began to cry, burying her face in her hands. "She promised me it was a surprise," she sobbed. "She said you would sign the signature cards later. She never brought them back." I realized then the true depth of my parents' betrayal. They did not just steal money. They orchestrated a highly calculated financial crime, weaponizing their personal friendships to commit federal identity theft. They left a paper trail that pointed a neon sign directly at my head. If the state attorney investigated this, they would see an account in my name, my social security number, and my inheritance. Carmen would deny everything to save her own pension and avoid federal prison. It would be my word against a mountain of fraudulent documents. I snatched my papers off her desk. "Do not call my mother," I warned her. "If you warn her I was here, my next stop is the FBI field office." I walked out of the credit union, the Miami heat hitting me like a physical wall. This was no longer a family disagreement over a mismanaged will. This was a sophisticated framing operation. If I failed to prove my innocence, I would not just lose my career, I would face decades in a federal penitentiary. I needed firepower. I needed someone who specialized in dismantling financial illusions. When you work in luxury real estate, you hear whispers about the fixers, the people wealthy developers call when the numbers do not match the blueprints. I drove back to my condo and opened my laptop. I searched for a man named David Klein. David was a former IRS investigator turned private forensic accountant. He had a reputation for being ruthless, clinical, and terrifyingly brilliant at tracking hidden assets. His office was located in a sleek high-rise in downtown Fort Lauderdale. I did not call to make an appointment. I drove straight there and refused to leave the waiting room until his secretary allowed me inside. David sat behind a heavy glass desk. He wore a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exuding a sharp, predatory intelligence. I laid the demand letter, the bank statements, and a sticky note with Carmen Delgado's name on the glass. My parents stole $500,000 from my dead grandmother and used a corrupt bank manager to frame me for the theft, I said. I need you to find where the money actually went. David picked up the bank statements. He did not ask about my feelings. He did not offer sympathy. He merely scanned the transaction codes with calculating eyes. These wires are structured, he finally said, pointing a silver pen at the outbound transfers. They kept the amounts just under the $10,000 reporting threshold to avoid triggering an automatic federal flag. Your parents did not do this on a whim. This was planned for months. He looked up at me, his expression hardening. I can find the money, Lauren. Forensic accounting always finds the true floor, but my services require a specific kind of commitment. The people you are fighting are desperate, and desperate people escalate when cornered. I nodded, swallowing the dry lump in my throat. I am ready, I told him. Do whatever it takes. David leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. Good, he said smoothly. My retainer is $15,000, and I need the wire transfer cleared by tomorrow morning before I open a single file. My heart dropped into my stomach. $15,000. I had just lost my biggest appraisal client. My emergency savings were already dangerously low. I was staring at the exact amount of money I did not have, knowing it was the only thing standing between me and a prison sentence. $15,000. The number hung in the crisp, air-conditioned atmosphere of David Klein's office like a suspended blade. I did not blink. I nodded once, stood up, and walked out into the sweltering downtown street. The afternoon humidity hit me instantly, wrapping around my shoulders like a wet blanket. My sedan felt like a furnace, the dark leather seats searing the back of my legs as I slid behind the wheel. I sat there with the engine off, staring blindly at the concrete wall of the parking garage, doing the brutal arithmetic of survival. My emergency fund held exactly $8,000. The rest of my liquid cash was tied up in the upcoming mortgage payment for my condo and my quarterly estimated taxes. I had relied heavily on the $20 million hotel appraisal contract to carry me through the next 3 months. Diego Suarez canceling that contract had severed my primary financial artery. My family had effectively cut off my oxygen supply, and now I had to pay a premium just to breathe. Every dollar I spent from this moment forward was a countdown timer to my own ruin. I turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life, a familiar, steady rumble. I looked at the dashboard of my reliable imported sedan. It was fully paid off, a testament to years of careful budgeting and skipped vacations. It represented my autonomy. It was my vehicle to property inspections, client meetings, and my escape route from uncomfortable family dinners. Now, it was just equity sitting on 4 wheels. I drove straight to a sprawling automotive dealership positioned right off the turnpike. The lot was an ocean of blazing metal reflecting the harsh Florida sun. I bypassed the showroom and navigated to the purchasing center around the back. A young evaluator with a clipboard and a polo shirt came out to inspect the vehicle. The irony tasted bitter in the back of my throat. I spent my days walking through waterfront mansions, calculating depreciation, assessing structural integrity, and determining market value for desperate sellers. Today, I was the desperate seller. I watched through the glass windows of the waiting area as the evaluator circled my car. He checked the tire tread, popped the hood, and noted a tiny scratch near the rear bumper. He was reducing the value of my independence piece by piece. When he finally returned to the desk, he offered me $12,000. It was $2,000 below market value, but I did not have the luxury of negotiation. Time was a commodity I could no longer afford. I signed the transfer papers, surrendered the spare keys, and accepted the cashier's check. An hour later, I sat in the back of a rideshare vehicle, watching the palm trees blur past the window. My purse rested heavy on my lap, containing the paper check that represented my former mobility. Stripping away my assets felt like peeling off a layer of my own skin. The silence in the back of the car was oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise usually filling my brain. When I unlocked the door to my condo, the empty space greeted me with a hollow echo. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The familiar jingle was entirely absent, replaced by a dull clatter. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of tap water, my hands trembling slightly. I leaned against the quartz counter and looked toward the living room. On the corner table sat a framed photograph. It was an old picture, the colors slightly faded by years of sunlight. It showed a younger version of me standing next to Abuela Rosa. I closed my eyes and let the memory pull me backward. I was 10 years old, visiting her small property in Central Florida. The air up there was different from the salty coastal breeze of Miami. It smelled of dry earth and sweet, blooming orange blossoms. We were walking through her modest citrus grove. The afternoon sun beat down on our shoulders, and the ground was littered with fallen, overripe fruit. Abuela Rosa stopped and crouched down, her calloused, weathered hand scooping up a handful of dirt. She held it out to me, letting the coarse sand slip through her fingers until only small, solid rocks remained in her palm. She looked up at me, her dark eyes fierce and clear. "Your father builds his houses on Sand Lauren," she told me, her voice raspy and deliberate. "He builds beautiful things that wash away when the storm hits, because he cares more about the paint than the pillars." She pressed one of the smooth rocks into my small hand, wrapping my fingers tightly around it. "You are different. You build yours on bedrock. It takes longer. It is harder work. But when the hurricane comes, you will be the only one left standing." I opened my eyes, staring at the empty living room. Abuela Rosa had understood the true nature of the Rodriguez family long before I ever did. Florida real estate was the perfect metaphor for my entire existence. My parents and my brother chased the waterfront properties, the stucco mansions with the infinity pools and the imported marble countertops. They bought into the illusion of wealth, the beautiful, rotting facades that masked severe termite damage and sinking foundations. They lived in a world of leverage, borrowing against tomorrow to show off today. I chose the opposite path. I became an appraiser because I needed to know the truth beneath the drywall. I needed to know the actual value of a structure, stripped of its staging and its manicured lawns. My grandmother had left her legacy to me because she knew I would not squander it on sports cars or country club dues. She trusted me to protect the bedrock. My parents had stolen that trust, and in doing so, they had unleashed the storm. The next morning, I stood in line at a generic branch of my national bank. I deposited the car dealership check and immediately filled out a wire transfer form. I handed the slip to the teller. She processed the paperwork with mundane efficiency, her fingers clacking rhythmically across her keyboard. She had no idea she was transmitting my entire safety net. When she handed me the confirmation receipt, my checking account balance read $312. I folded the receipt, placed it in my wallet, and walked out into the morning heat. I was fully committed. There was no turning back, no safety parachute, no alternative route. The waiting was a unique kind of torture. For 2 days, I sat in my condo, pacing the hardwood floors. I refreshed my email every 10 minutes. I researched federal wire fraud statutes until my vision blurred. I ate stale cereal and drank black coffee, conserving my remaining cash. The isolation was profound. My phone, which used to ring constantly with client requests and family updates, remained a dead brick of glass and metal. On the afternoon of the third day, the sharp, jarring tone of an incoming call shattered the silence of my apartment. The caller identification displayed David Klein's office number. I answered on the first ring, pressing the speaker tightly against my ear. "I have the initial tracking data," David announced. His voice was clinical, devoid of any reassuring warmth, which was exactly what I was paying for. "Did you find it?" I asked, my pulse pounding against my throat. "Your grandmother's funds did not stay in the fraudulent credit union account for more than 72 hours, he explained, the sound of flipping pages echoing through the receiver. The wire was broken down into smaller, structured transactions. They bounced the money through 2 intermediary holding accounts to wash the origin trail. It is a classic layering technique used in financial crimes to confuse standard banking algorithms. "Can you see where it landed?" I pressed, my grip tightening on the phone. "Yes," he replied smoothly. "They consolidated the washed funds and pushed the entire remaining balance into a corporate entity. It is a shell company. I am currently pulling the registration data to pierce the corporate veil, but it will take a little more time to map the exact ownership structure." I let out a long, shaky breath. The fact that the money existed somewhere in a corporate ledger meant it could be recovered. It meant the paper trail was real, and it was bleeding directly away from my name. "Listen to me very carefully, Lauren," David continued, his tone dropping an octave, turning deadly serious. "I have been hunting hidden assets for 2 decades. Financial criminals follow a very predictable psychological pattern. Right now, your parents believe they have successfully cornered you. They believe your silence means you are defeated. But the moment my inquiries trigger a flag in their corporate banking network, they will realize you are fighting back." "What does that mean?" I asked, a cold chill creeping down my spine despite the warm air in the room. "It means a cornered predator is incredibly dangerous," David warned. "When they realize the scapegoat has stopped running, they will launch a counteroffensive. They are going to try to neutralize you before you can expose them. You need to be prepared. They will strike again, and they will strike closer to home." The line disconnected, leaving me listening to the hollow dial tone. I lowered the phone, looking toward the heavy wooden door of my condo. The ticking clock had just accelerated. My family was not done with me yet. The echo of David Klein's warning had barely faded from my living room when 3 sharp knocks rattled my front door. I did not move at first. The heavy silence of my condo pressed against my ears. The digital clock on the microwave glowed with the late afternoon hour. I walked softly toward the entryway, placing my hand flat against the cool wood, and leaned into the peephole. Standing in the fluorescent light of the corridor was my older brother. Brandon wore a tailored linen suit that looked fresh off a designer rack. Beside him stood his wife Ashley. Ashley grew up in a wealthy Tampa suburb and always projected the polished, effortless aura of someone who never had to check a price tag. She wore an oversized pair of designer sunglasses pushed back into her blonde hair and clutched a pristine leather handbag. I unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy door swung open, allowing the conditioned air of the hallway to mix with the stillness of my apartment. "Lauren," Brandon said, his voice dripping with a practiced, sorrowful empathy. He offered a weary sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "We need to talk. Please let us in." I stepped aside, keeping my posture rigid. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a glass of water. They walked past me, their expensive cologne and perfume leaving a heavy floral trail in my foyer. Ashley glanced around my modest living space. Her eyes paused on the generic baseboards and the simple furniture, a silent judgment passing across her features. She married into the Rodriguez family expecting an empire, blinded by the country club memberships and the leased luxury vehicles my parents flaunted. Brandon turned to face me, placing his hands in his pockets. He looked around, shaking his head slowly. "This has gone too far," he began, maintaining steady eye contact. The family is tearing itself apart. Mom is crying every night. Dad is meeting with the state prosecutors on Monday to finalize the criminal complaint. They want you arrested, Lauren. They feel they have no other choice. I crossed my arms, feeling the steady rhythm of my pulse against my ribs. And you came here to tell me this out of the goodness of your heart? I asked. Ashley stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on Brandon's arm. We came here because we care about you, she said softly. We know you made a terrible mistake. People get desperate. We understand that. Brandon wants to help you fix it before you end up in a federal courtroom. My brother nodded, adopting the role of the benevolent savior. He had played this character his entire life. Whenever he wrecked a car or failed a college semester, he always managed to spin the narrative, making himself the victim of circumstance, waiting for my parents to swoop in with a checkbook. Now he was trying to cast me as the helpless sinner in need of his grace. I talked to Dad, Brandon continued, taking a slow step toward me. I spent 3 hours calming him down yesterday. I convinced him to pause the legal proceedings. He is willing to drop the entire lawsuit, Lauren. He will tell the extended family it was a terrible accounting error. A simple misunderstanding between the trust executor and the bank. You get your life back. Your appraisal clients will return. The whispers will stop. I kept my expression neutral, hiding the sharp spike of adrenaline coursing through my veins. And what is the price for this miracle? I inquired. Brandon offered a warm, forgiving smile. It was the exact smile he used to charm investors into his doomed business ventures. It is not a price, he assured me. It is a reallocation. We know you still have the majority of Abuela Rosa's money. You cannot keep it, but giving it back to Mom and Dad directly right now will just ignite their anger again. So we bypass them. You wire the remaining $200,000 into the operating account of my fitness center. We classify it as an angel investment on paper. It washes the tension away. I go to Dad, show him the funds are secured within the family network, and he calls off the lawyers. I protect you, and the money stays safe. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I stared at my older brother, evaluating the pitch he just delivered. He delivered it flawlessly, with the confident cadence of a seasoned salesman. To an outsider, it might have sounded like a lifeline. To someone suffocating under the weight of social exile and legal threats, it might have looked like the only exit door. But I appraise structures for a living. I look for the hidden rot behind the fresh coat of paint. My mind rapidly disassembled his proposal. If I logged into my bank portal and executed a wire transfer of $200,000 to his corporate account, I would generate an indelible digital footprint. I would be transferring funds I supposedly stole. By sending him the money, I would provide the exact empirical evidence my parents lacked. I would be handing the district attorney a documented confession, establishing a direct money trail originating from my hands. It was a trap. A brilliant, lethal, devastating trap. And it revealed something else. Brandon needed cash, immediately. The empty parking lot at his boutique gym was not just a slow business day. He was drowning. He was trying to extort me to cover his own failing margins, using the threat of our father as leverage. You want me to wire you $200,000? I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the silent apartment. It saves you, Ashley chimed in, her voice tightening with a sudden edge of impatience. It is a clean way out, Lauren. Do not be stubborn. You ruined the family barbecue. You embarrassed Patricia in front of everyone. Take the deal. I uncrossed my arms and stood to my full height. I looked at Ashley, noting the slight tremor in her hands clutching the designer bag, and then I locked eyes with Brandon. I do not have the money, I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register. I did not forge the signature. I did not open the account at Suncoast Cooperative. And I will not send a single cent to your bankrupt gym to manufacture a confession. The benevolent savior mask slid right off Brandon's face. The transformation was startling. The warm, forgiving brother vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. His jaw clenched, the muscles ticking visibly beneath his skin. His eyes darkened, stripping away the charm to reveal the sheer panic and venom underneath. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, stepping so close I could smell the peppermint on his breath. "You always thought you were better than us, playing the independent, hard-working martyr. You have no idea what you are dealing with." I stood my ground, refusing to retreat a single inch. "I am dealing with a fraud," I replied evenly. "Get out of my home." Ashley grabbed his elbow, pulling him back toward the entryway. "Let us go," she urged, casting a nervous glance at my security camera mounted near the ceiling. "She is not going to listen." Brandon let himself be pulled toward the door, but he kept his dark gaze fixed on me. "If you do not play ball, Dad is going to bury you," he threatened, his voice echoing in the small foyer. "We tried to give you an easy exit. When the police show up at your door with a warrant, remember that I offered you a way out. You brought this on yourself." He pulled the front door open, dragging Ashley into the corridor. The heavy wood slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the floorboards. I walked over and slid the deadbolt into place. My knees felt weak, trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a cold hollow in my stomach. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes. The narrative my family was spinning started to take a new shape. Brandon acted like the mastermind today. He was the one demanding the cash. He was the one dangling the lawsuit over my head. To any observer, he looked like the sole architect of the theft, desperately trying to squeeze the last drops of the inheritance to save his failing business, using our parents' blind loyalty to cover his tracks. It made perfect sense. He stole the funds, parked them in the shell company David found, and now he needed more. But I remembered the precise, methodical nature of the wire transfers David described. The structured layering, the holding accounts, the incorporation of the Delaware LLC. Brandon was charismatic, but he was lazy. He lacked the discipline and the financial acumen to execute a multi-stage corporate money laundering scheme. He could barely manage his own credit card payments without asking our father for a bailout. He was a piece of the puzzle, a loud, desperate distraction. The red herring sent to rattle my cage. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. I stared at the blank screen, the silence of my condo wrapping around me once again. The Delaware Shell Company, Suncoast Holdings, held the true answer. Brandon was connected to it, but he did not build it alone. I needed to see the public property records. I needed to look at the exact real estate transactions that entity was executing. If my brother was hiding behind a corporate veil, I needed to figure out who was holding the curtain. The game of intimidation had failed. It was time to use my professional access to follow the paper trail. The morning sun crested over the Atlantic Ocean, casting long and sharp shadows across my living room floor. I had not slept a single minute. The encounter with my brother left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. Brandon had played his role flawlessly, acting as the desperate and greedy sibling trying to extort cash to save his failing boutique gym. But the math behind his performance felt incredibly hollow. He was a distraction. I poured a cup of black coffee, the dark liquid matching the exhaustion settling behind my eyes. I sat at my kitchen island and flipped open my laptop, letting the bright screen illuminate my face. I needed to bypass the emotional theater and follow the empirical data. I picked up my phone and dialed David Klein. He answered on the second ring, his tone brisk and clinical. "I pierced the first 2 layers of the holding accounts," David announced without offering a greeting. "The funds were funneled into a corporate entity registered in Delaware. It operates under the name Suncoast Holdings." I typed the name into a blank digital notepad on my screen. "Who owns it?" I asked, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "That is where we hit a structural wall," David replied. The sound of his own keyboard clicks echoing over the cellular line. Delaware is a domestic tax haven. Their corporate secrecy laws are specifically designed to shield ownership identities from the public. The registry only lists a generic registered agent. Thousands of shell companies use the exact same address to hide their true beneficiaries. To crack the ownership matrix and legally prove who controls Suncoast Holdings, I need a federal subpoena. That process requires a judge and takes months. We do not have months. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. My father was supposedly meeting with state prosecutors on Monday to finalize his criminal complaint against me. Time was a luxury I could not afford to purchase. I do not need a subpoena, I told him, my voice steadying as my professional instincts took over. I appraise commercial property in South Florida. I have authorized access to restricted municipal databases. If Suncoast Holdings bought or sold a single square foot of dirt in this state, I will find their fingerprint. Let me do my job. I disconnected the call and closed my eyes for a brief second. My parents thought they were dealing with an obedient, naive daughter they could easily intimidate. They forgot they were fighting a licensed property appraiser. I opened a secured web portal and entered my state credentials, clearing the two-factor authentication protocols. The Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser database loaded on my screen. This was my sanctuary. This system did not care about family gossip, country club memberships, or tearful Sunday barbecues. It only cared about parcel numbers, zoning codes, and recorded deeds. I typed Suncoast Holdings into the primary owner search bar and pressed enter. The system processed the query for a few tense seconds. 3 rows of data populated the screen. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the asset descriptions and square footage metrics. I expected to see luxury condos in Brickell or perhaps a sleek commercial storefront in Coral Gables. I expected to find the paper trail leading to my brother's failing fitness center. Instead, the addresses pointed to the far western edge of the county. I clicked on the Interactive Geographic Information System map. The satellite imagery zoomed in rapidly, trading the manicured green lawns and blue swimming pools of the coastline for the saturated murky browns of the Florida wetlands. Suncoast Holdings had recently acquired 3 parcels of distressed raw swampland bordering the Everglades. I studied the topography reports and the strict municipal zoning restrictions. The purchase made zero conventional sense. The land was entirely undeveloped, prone to severe seasonal flooding, and lacked any basic utility connections. You do not buy this kind of property to build a gym or a vacation home. The environmental mitigation costs alone would bankrupt a standard developer. You buy this kind of remote dirt for one of 2 reasons. Either you are a high-volume commercial titan gambling on a 10-year municipal rezoning project, or you are deeply underwater on a terrible investment and need a cheap, untraceable asset to leverage against another failing loan. My brother lacked the patience and the intellect for a 10-year real estate gamble. This smelled like panic. This smelled like a desperate, reckless attempt to park dirty money. I needed to see the actual transfer documents. I navigated to the county clerk interface and requested the digitized PDF scans of the warranty deeds for the swampland acquisitions. The large file downloaded heavily onto my local drive. I opened the document, my eyes tracking the dense legal jargon and the boilerplate clauses. I scrolled down past the property descriptions to the buyer execution page. The signature for Suncoast Holdings was an illegible looping scrawl, signed by a third-party corporate proxy. A deliberate dead end. Whoever orchestrated this purchase knew exactly how to insulate themselves from standard public scrutiny. But real estate transactions in Florida share a universal, unavoidable vulnerability. They require a notary public to verify the identity of the signing parties. A proxy can sign the line, but a licensed notary must stamp the paper, binding the document to legal reality. I scrolled to the very bottom of the final page, magnifying the image to 200% on my monitor. A standard black ink notary seal sat stamped next to the proxy signature. I stared at the circular emblem, reading the name of the notary and the commission expiration date. The name listed was a generic, untraceable identity that likely belonged to a stolen license. But my eyes caught a microscopic detail within the ink impression itself. 10 years ago, my father Hector went through a brutal, months-long audit with the State Revenue Service. He had tried to flip a distressed waterfront property and hide the capital gains through a series of shady transfers. I was 20 years old at the time, sitting in his home office, watching him shred documents late into the night. The room smelled of expensive cigar smoke and imported scotch. He had laughed, a deep and arrogant sound, pulling a custom rubber stamp from his locked mahogany desk drawer. He bragged to me that he paid a vendor in Hialeah cash to manufacture a counterfeit notary seal. It allowed him to backdate deed transfers and dodge thousands in property taxes. I remembered holding the heavy wooden handle of that fake stamp. I remembered the specific, undeniable manufacturing flaw on the rubber face. The vendor had misspelled the word commission, leaving out the second letter I. Furthermore, the rubber was slightly uneven on the left edge, causing the black ink to pool heavily whenever he pressed it down, creating a thick, dark crescent moon shape alongside the border. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, my breath catching in my throat. I traced the digitized ink on the swampland deed with a trembling finger. The left edge of the circular seal was unnaturally thick, forming a dark crescent moon. I dragged my cursor over the tiny, blurred text wrapping around the state emblem. Commission. The second I was missing. A cold, electric shock traveled down my spine. The room around me seemed to fade into a hollow silence. Brandon did not orchestrate this theft. Brandon did not know how to navigate Delaware's secrecy laws or structure intermediary holding accounts. He was just the loud, greedy distraction sent to my front door to rattle my nerves and test my defenses. The architect of my ruin was the man who stood on the patio with a heavy arm around my mother, looking at me with manufactured disappointment. My father. Hector had used his private counterfeit notary stamp to authorize the acquisition of the Everglades swampland through the Shell Company. He used the stolen funds from Abuela Rosa's trust to finance the transaction. He forged my signature and framed his own daughter to cover a desperate, catastrophic real estate gamble. The betrayal was no longer just emotional or social. It was forensic. It was tied directly to his own locked desk drawer. I hit the print command on my keyboard. The laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out warm pages of undeniable proof. I gathered the sheets, the paper feeling heavy with truth. My parents thought I was just a naive appraiser they could discard to save their country club reputation. They failed to realize that when you teach your daughter how to spot structural damage, she will eventually find the rot in her own foundation. I grabbed my car keys, knowing exactly what I had to bring to David Klein to tear their corporate veil to shreds. I drove back to downtown Fort Lauderdale with the printed swampland deed sitting on my passenger seat. The midday sun baked the asphalt of the interstate, creating shimmering mirages over the traffic lanes. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the cabin allowed my thoughts to organize into a sharp, linear sequence. The missing letter in the notary stamp was not just a clerical error. It was a forensic key. It proved my father was actively executing real estate transactions for Suncoast Holdings. I pulled into the parking garage beneath David Klein's office building, grabbed the warm sheets of paper, and headed straight for the elevator. The receptionist did not try to stop me this time. I walked directly into David's office and placed the printed deed flat on his glass desk. He looked up from his dual monitors, his brow furrowing slightly at the interruption. "Look at the notary seal on the final page," I told him, pointing to the dark crescent moon ink stain. The word commission is missing the second letter I. My father manufactured that counterfeit stamp a decade ago to bypass county tax assessments. He used it to authorize this swampland acquisition for the Shell Company. David leaned forward, his clinical detachment shifting into sharp focus. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his top drawer and inspected the printed ink. A slow, precise smile formed on his face. "You found the structural fracture," he murmured. "Delaware shields their corporate registry, but when you purchase raw land in Florida, you must file a documentary stamp tax return with the State Department of Revenue. If they used a counterfeit notary on the deed, they likely submitted the same fraudulent seal on the tax filings. The Department of Revenue requires a federal employer identification number and an unredacted list of beneficial owners for tax compliance." David turned back to his keyboard. His fingers moved with rapid, deliberate purpose. I stood by the window, watching the boats navigate the intracoastal waterway below. The weight stretched my nerves thin. My father had always been a proud man. He wore tailored suits, drove imported sedans, and made sure everyone at the Riviera Country Club knew his name. Discovering he was the architect of my current ruin felt like swallowing broken glass. I had spent my entire life trying to earn his respect, choosing a difficult career path to prove my worth, while Brandon received endless praise for doing nothing. Now I knew why. My independence was a threat to their fragile ecosystem. The laser printer in the corner of David's office clicked and began to hum. A single sheet of paper slid into the output tray. David picked it up, his eyes scanning the data blocks. The silence in the room grew heavy. He did not hand the paper to me immediately. He placed it face up on the glass desk and tapped the center paragraph with his silver pen. "Brandon did not build this trap," David stated, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. "He is merely a passenger. Read the beneficial ownership structure." I stepped up to the desk and looked down at the state tax filing. The document listed the managing members of Suncoast Holdings. The ownership was divided into precise percentages. 50% belonged to Brandon Rodriguez. The other 50% belonged to Hector and Patricia Rodriguez. The breath left my lungs. My knees locked. It was one thing to suspect my father was helping my brother hide stolen money. It was an entirely different reality to see my parents listed as equal partners in the corporate entity that laundered my inheritance. This was not a rescue mission for a wayward son. This was a joint criminal enterprise. My mother and father had forged my signature, opened a fraudulent credit union account, and drained Abuela Rosa's trust to enrich themselves. I stared at the names printed in stark black ink. The puzzle pieces from the past 3 years began to snap together with devastating clarity. 3 years ago, my father made a highly leveraged gamble. He purchased a sprawling tract of commercial real estate near the Everglades, betting the county would approve a lucrative rezoning permit for a new shopping district. The Environmental Board rejected the proposal. The land instantly lost 80% of its market value. Hector was left holding a crushing underwater mortgage with a ruthless private lender calling in the margins. During that exact same window of time, Brandon's previous tech startup collapsed under a quiet fraud investigation. Several private investors sued my brother for misappropriating their seed capital. I remembered the tense family dinners. I remembered my father drinking too much scotch, his face pale and drawn, while my mother snapped at the serving staff. They were facing total financial ruin. Bankruptcy would have meant liquidating their assets. It would have meant losing the Coral Gables house, forfeiting the country club memberships, and surrendering their elite social standing in Miami. To my parents, losing their social facade was a fate worse than death. Abuela Rosa passed away, leaving a liquid, untethered trust fund of $450,000 strictly in my name. She knew her son was reckless. She tried to bypass his greed. But Hector and Patricia saw a lifeline. They could not afford to let that capital sit in my control while their empire crumbled. They needed cash to satisfy the private lender and settle Brandon's fraud lawsuits before the news hit the local papers. So they sacrificed their daughter. They framed me, washed the capital through Suncoast Holdings, and paid their secret debts. They threw me to the wolves to preserve their beautiful, rotting illusion. You understand what this means, David said, interrupting my thoughts. His voice pulled me back to the cold reality of his office. Your parents are the primary beneficiaries of the wire fraud. They orchestrated the identity theft. Brandon is an accomplice, but Hector and Patricia hold the reins. I looked up from the document. The lingering sadness I had carried since the Sunday barbecue evaporated. The desire for their approval vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They chose their country club status over my freedom. They were willing to watch me go to federal prison just to keep their luxury cars parked in the driveway. I folded the tax document and slid it into my purse. The paper felt like a weapon. I finally held the empirical truth. We have the paper trail, I told David. My voice did not shake. We can prove they own the shell company. We can prove they received the stolen funds. We have a definitive link, David corrected, leaning back in his leather chair. But you need to tread very carefully right now. My digital inquiries into the state tax registry will generate an automated notification. The registered agent for Suncoast Holdings will receive an alert that their ownership documents were pulled. Your father is going to know someone is looking behind the curtain. He will realize his counterfeit notary stamp failed to protect his identity. A sharp vibration buzzed against my thigh. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen illuminated with a new text message. I had not received a single communication from my parents since the day they chased me out of their yard. I opened the notification. It was a direct message from my mother. It was brief, lacking any of her usual performative warmth. We are hosting a private family gathering tomorrow evening, the message read. You need to be there. We have a solution to this problem, but you must attend in person. I stared at the glowing text. A solution. David was right. The cornered predators knew the net was closing, and they were attempting to lure me back into their territory. They were setting a new psychological trap, hoping to neutralize the threat before I could take my evidence to the authorities. I looked at David, my pulse adopting a slow, steady rhythm. The next phase of this war was no longer about playing defense. It was time to walk right into their snare and see what kind of bait they were using. The drive to my parents' Coral Gables estate felt entirely different tonight. Yesterday, I was a victim racing to find answers. Today, I was an executioner carrying a loaded weapon in my handbag. I pulled my rental car onto the circular driveway, the crushed gravel crunching beneath the tires. The sprawling Mediterranean-style house glowed under the warm light of the exterior landscaping fixtures. It looked like a fortress of success. But I knew the truth now. The foundation was crumbling, mortgaged to the hilt, propped up by stolen legacy and desperate fraud. I walked up the wide brick pathway. The heavy oak front door was slightly ajar, the sound of clinking glass and muted conversation drifting into the humid evening air. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air conditioning chilled the sweat on my neck. The private family gathering was in full swing. My aunts, uncles, and older cousins milled about the sunken living room, holding crystal wine glasses and picking at catered appetizers. The moment my shoes clicked against the marble tile, the ambient noise died. The silence was heavy, thick with judgment and whispered gossip. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Aunt Rosora stood near the fireplace, her expression hardening as she deliberately turned her back. The coordinated social exile was designed to break my spirit, to make me feel small and isolated before the main event. It was a classic interrogation tactic. Starve the subject of warmth, surround them with hostile silence, and they will agree to anything just to escape the pressure. Patricia detached herself from a group of relatives near the wet bar. She wore a tailored silk blouse and her signature vintage diamond tennis bracelet, the very diamonds purchased with my grandmother's stolen trust fund. She did not look angry. Instead, she wore a mask of profound, weary sorrow. "Lauren," she murmured, her voice pitching loud enough for the room to hear. I am glad you decided to show up. Please come with me. We need to talk privately. She gestured toward the kitchen, leading the way with the graceful stride of a woman who believed she held all the cards. I followed her, my posture straight, my hand gripping the leather strap of my purse. The kitchen was a masterpiece of imported granite and stainless steel, far removed from the judging eyes of the living room. Patricia closed the heavy double doors behind us, shutting out the rest of the family. The sudden quiet hum of the refrigerator dominated the space. My mother walked over to the sprawling center island. She did not offer me a drink. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply picked up a thick stack of legal paper resting next to a vase of fresh orchids and slid it across the polished stone surface. Your father and I have discussed this at length, Patricia began, her tone adopting the soothing, condescending cadence of a teacher addressing a slow student. We know things have gotten out of hand. The lawyers are expensive, the family is stressed, and we hate seeing you struggle like this. We know you lost your primary appraisal contract. We know you sold your car. You are drowning Lauren. I looked down at the documents. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, Non-Disclosure and Settlement Agreement. We want to offer you a clean slate, she continued, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. We understand people make desperate choices. We are willing to forgive you. If you sign that paperwork, your father will formally withdraw the police complaint. We will issue a statement to the family explaining that the trust mismanagement was a terrible accounting error, and you are taking steps to rectify it. I reached out and traced the edge of the paper. And what are my obligations under this generous arrangement? I inquired, keeping my voice level and devoid of emotion. Patricia offered a tight, smug smile. You accept full legal responsibility for the accounting error in writing. You agree to waive any right to contest the remaining estate balance. You agree to cease all contact with the extended family to allow everyone time to heal. And in exchange, we will wire $50,000 into your checking account by tomorrow morning. It is enough capital for you to pack up your condo, move to a different state, and start over. She finished her pitch and waited, her chin tilted upward. She thought she was delivering a masterstroke of diplomacy. In her mind, I was destitute, terrified, and backed into a corner. She had monitored my professional downfall. She knew I sold my vehicle. She assumed I was desperate enough to take the cash, sign the confession, and disappear into exile. To Patricia, $50,000 was a cheap price to permanently erase the only witness to her federal crimes. I stood there in the pristine kitchen, the air cool against my skin, savoring the profound, beautiful irony of the moment. Inside my leather handbag, resting less than 12 inches from the fraudulent settlement agreement, was David Klein's forensic report. I had the printed Delaware corporate registry proving she and Hector owned 50% of the shell company. I had the zoomed-in photograph of the counterfeit notary stamp. I possessed the exact date and time the stolen funds were funneled into her corporate accounts. I held the empirical proof that could send both her and my father to a federal penitentiary for a decade. And here she was, standing in her imported silk blouse, trying to bribe me with a fraction of my own stolen inheritance. The contrast between her towering arrogance and her actual vulnerability was staggering. I did not feel angry anymore. The fiery rage that had consumed me during the Sunday barbecue had burned down into a cold, hardened ash. I looked at the woman who raised me, truly seeing her for the first time. She was not a matriarch protecting her flock. She was a cornered, desperate fraud trying to buy her way out of a burning building. You want me to sign a confession, I repeated, ensuring the terms were perfectly clear. I take the blame for the theft. I leave Florida forever. And you get to keep playing the tragic, betrayed mother. It is the best deal you are ever going to get, Lauren, she warned, the soothing cadence dropping to reveal the sharp edge underneath. Do not be stupid. You have no money. You have no career left in Miami. Your father is ready to hand the bank ledgers to the district attorney. Take the cash and run. Start a new life where nobody knows what you did." I placed my hand flat on the stack of paper. I felt the smooth texture of the legal document beneath my palm. I pushed it slowly across the granite island, the pages sliding back until they rested directly in front of her perfectly manicured hands. "Keep your money," I said quietly, holding her gaze without blinking. "I am keeping my name." The smug smile vanished from Patricia's face. The mask shattered into 1,000 invisible pieces. Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine confusion and primal fear flashing across her features. For the first time in my 30 years of existence, my mother did not have a rehearsed response. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The confident posture collapsed, her shoulders slumping slightly as the reality of my refusal registered in her brain. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," she finally hissed, her voice trembling with an emotion that sounded remarkably like panic. "We will destroy you." I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy kitchen doors. I reached the brass handles and paused, glancing over my shoulder. "You cannot destroy something built on bedrock," I told her. I pushed through the doors and walked back into the living room. The hostile silence returned, the dozens of judging eyes tracking my every movement. I did not lower my head. I walked straight through the crowd, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor, and exited the front door. The humid Florida night embraced me as I stepped off the porch. The psychological trap had failed. My parents had fired their best shot, attempting to bribe me into a permanent, silent exile. By rejecting the settlement, I had silently communicated that I was not afraid of their legal threats. My father would undoubtedly realize his intimidation tactics were useless. He would soon discover the digital alert triggered by David's background check on Suncoast Holdings. I climbed into my rental car and started the engine. The war was entering its final, most dangerous phase. My parents were isolated in their arrogance, but my older brother Brandon was still a wild card. He owned the other half of the fraudulent shell company. He was married to a woman who prized her wealthy lifestyle above all else. Before I could drop the forensic bomb on my parents, I needed to neutralize the golden boy. I needed to ensure he could not rush to their defense or complicate the narrative. I pulled out of the driveway, my mind already calculating the precise pressure points required to break Ashley. It was time to separate the weak link from the chain. I needed a surgical strike. The confrontation in my parents' kitchen proved that Hector and Patricia were operating on blind arrogance, but Brandon was a different variable. He was a cornered animal with half ownership of a fraudulent shell company. If I walked into a final family showdown without neutralizing him first, he would undoubtedly panic, raise his voice, and throw up a smokescreen of lies to protect his own skin. I could not allow any distractions. I needed my older brother entirely muted. And the fastest way to muzzle a loud man is to threaten his wife. I sent a brief text message to Ashley early Friday morning. I told her I was ready to discuss a financial arrangement, but I would only speak with her face to face. I chose a high-end artisan coffee shop in the heart of Coral Gables for our meeting. It was neutral ground, highly public, and exactly the kind of pretentious environment where she felt powerful. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordered a black espresso, and secured a small corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun illuminated the bustling sidewalk outside, filled with wealthy professionals and luxury vehicles. I watched the glass entrance, my pulse steady, my mind reviewing the precise sequence of leverage I was about to apply. She walked through the doors precisely on time. Ashley wore a crisp white linen dress and oversized tortoiseshell sunglasses, clutching a familiar imported leather handbag. She scanned the busy room, her lips pressed into a tight and annoyed line. When she spotted me in the corner, she did not offer a polite greeting. She navigated through the crowded cafe with the distinct posture of someone stepping over a puddle. She pulled out the metal chair across from me and sat down, refusing to remove her dark sunglasses. I am only giving you 10 minutes, Lauren, Ashley stated. Her tone was sharp and dismissive, meant to establish immediate dominance. Brandon does not even know I am here today. He would be furious if he found out I was entertaining this conversation. We already offered you a very generous exit strategy. If you are here to negotiate for a higher payout, you are wasting my time. Patricia told us you rejected the settlement paperwork last night. I took a slow sip of my espresso, letting the bitter heat wash over my tongue. I did not invite you here to ask for money, I replied calmly, setting the ceramic cup down on the saucer. I invited you here to save your business. Ashley let out a short, cynical laugh. My business is doing perfectly fine, she scoffed, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed organizational chart David Klein had generated the previous afternoon. I slid it across the smooth wooden table. It stopped directly in front of her manicured hands. I suggest you look closely at that corporate hierarchy, I told her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering her gaze to the document. I watched her eyes track the bold black lines connecting the printed boxes. At the very top sat Suncoast Holdings, the Delaware entity David had exposed. Below it, a solid black line connected directly to a subsidiary corporation. It was the exact legal name of her prized boutique fitness center. You and Brandon opened that gym 6 months ago, I explained, keeping my voice low and conversational so the neighboring tables could not hear. You signed a commercial lease in a premium zip code. You purchased hundreds of thousands of dollars in imported exercise equipment. You hired elite personal trainers. But your parking lot is empty every single afternoon. You do not have the membership revenue to sustain those daily operating costs. The capital keeping your doors open is flowing directly downward from Suncoast Holdings. Ashley stiffened, her posture growing rigid against the metal chair. My husband secured angel investors, she countered, though the arrogant edge in her voice wavered slightly. It is a standard corporate umbrella structure. There is nothing illegal about a parent company funding a subsidiary business. It is illegal when the parent company is a money laundering vehicle built entirely on stolen funds, I clarified. The color began to drain from Ashley's face. She finally reached up and removed her sunglasses, exposing wide and uncertain eyes. Suncoast Holdings was not funded by angel investors, I continued, leaning slightly closer. It was funded by my grandmother's estate. Hector and Patricia forged my signature, committed federal identity theft, and wired $450,000 into that shell company. Brandon owns 50% of that fraudulent entity. Your boutique fitness center is operating on stolen cash. Ashley stared at the paper, her breathing growing shallow. The implications hit her in real time. She grew up in a wealthy Tampa suburb, accustomed to comfort and supreme status. She married Brandon, assuming he would inherit a legitimate real estate empire. Instead, she was staring at the undeniable blueprint of a federal crime. Do you know what happens when the Federal Bureau of Investigation uncovers a wire fraud conspiracy? I asked her, letting the silence stretch for a moment. They do not just arrest the individuals involved. They execute civil asset forfeiture. They freeze every single bank account, seize every vehicle, and padlock every business tied to the dirty money. The moment I hand my forensic report to the authorities, the government will seize your gym. They will impound your husband's sports car. You will lose everything, Ashley. She covered her mouth with her hand, a soft and horrified gasp escaping her lips. I did not know, she whispered, her eyes darting frantically around the coffee shop as if federal agents were already waiting on the sidewalk outside. Lauren, I swear to you, I had no idea where the money came from. Brandon told me it was a clean investment from a private equity firm in Miami. He lied to me. I believe you. I lied smoothly, offering a small, sympathetic nod. which is why I am giving you a rare opportunity to survive the fallout. I rested my forearms on the table to command her full attention. I am filing the initial police reports on Monday morning. I am handing over the forged bank ledgers, the counterfeit notary stamps, and the state tax filings proving my parents orchestrated the theft. But a corporate investigation takes time to untangle. I will leave your fitness center out of my initial sworn statement, I promised. I will redact the subsidiary connections from my forensic binder. It will buy you a brief window of time. You can contact a divorce attorney. You can legally distance yourself from Brandon and the business before the federal agents freeze the assets. You can save yourself. Ashley swallowed hard, her pristine image entirely shattered by the weight of survival. "What do you want in exchange?" she asked, her voice trembling into a whisper. "Tomorrow is Sunday," I said. "We both know Aunt Rosora is planning a major family tribunal. She wants everyone gathered in one room to force my surrender. When I walk into that house, my father is going to lie. My mother is going to cry. I need Brandon silent. If he tries to defend them, if he raises his voice to challenge my evidence, or if he attempts to spin a new narrative, the deal is off. I will add your gym to the top of the asset forfeiture list and hand it directly to the detectives. You need to put a muzzle on your husband. You tell him whatever you need to tell him tonight, but tomorrow he does not speak." Ashley looked down at the organizational chart, her hands shaking slightly. She was calculating her survival. She looked at the expensive handbag resting on the chair beside her, then back at me. Her self-preservation instinct easily overrode any loyalty she held for my brother. "I will keep him quiet," she vowed, her tone turning cold and resolute. "He will not say a word, Lauren. You have my promise." I picked up my espresso cup and finished the remaining dark liquid. It tasted like victory. I stood up from the table, leaving the printed corporate chart resting in front of her. "Use the time wisely, Ashley," I advised. "The storm is going to hit very soon." I walked out of the coffee shop, stepping back into the bright Florida sunshine. I had successfully severed the golden boy from his protectors. Hector and Patricia would be fighting alone, entirely unaware that their primary backup was compromised. I unlocked my rental car and slid into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the notification on the screen. It was a direct text message from Aunt Rosora. The message was short and devoid of any familial warmth. "We are having a mandatory family meeting tomorrow evening at my house. You are summoned, Lauren. If you do not show up and explain yourself, your parents are filing criminal charges against you first thing Monday morning." The cornered predators were attempting to use the weight of the entire extended family to crush me. I placed the phone on the passenger seat and smiled. They wanted a public execution. I was going to give them one. The drive from the artisan coffee shop back to my Fort Lauderdale condominium passed in a strange, suspended haze. The text message from Aunt Rosora glowed on my phone screen, resting on the passenger seat, the words burning themselves into my memory. "Family meeting this Sunday. You are summoned. If you do not show, your parents are filing criminal charges against you on Monday." I parked in my designated spot, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the dim light of the concrete garage. Summoned. The word echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. It was not a request. It was a court order issued by the matriarch of the extended clan. For decades, Aunt Rosora's sprawling estate had served as the unofficial courthouse for the Rodriguez family. Whenever a cousin wanted to drop out of college, or an uncle needed a loan to cover a gambling debt, the family gathered in her sunken living room to pass judgment. The seating arrangements were always strategic. The elders occupied the plush leather sofas, forcing the accused to stand in the center of the imported Persian rug, surrounded by a jury of their own blood. I took the elevator up to my floor and walked into my apartment. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl and walked straight out onto the balcony. The late afternoon Florida sun cast a warm, golden hue over the coastal skyline. A salty breeze drifted off the Atlantic Ocean, rustling the palm fronds lining the street below. Usually, this view brought me a profound sense of peace. It was the physical manifestation of my hard work, a sanctuary I purchased with my own rigorous appraisals and long hours. Today, the breeze offered no comfort. I gripped the metal railing, feeling the lingering heat of the sun seeping into my palms. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a physical reaction to a deeply ingrained psychological trigger. Despite everything I had uncovered, despite the empirical evidence proving my innocence, a small, terrified part of my brain wanted to surrender. This was the insidious nature of growing up in a toxic household. My parents had spent 30 years conditioning me to be the shock absorber for their dysfunctions. When I was 15 years old, Brandon borrowed my father's car without permission and backed it into a concrete mailbox. Hector was furious, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. But instead of punishing his golden boy, my mother pulled me aside. She told me Brandon was under a lot of stress with his college applications. She told me the family needed peace. She instructed me to confess to the accident. I took the blame, enduring a month of being grounded and a relentless lecture on responsibility, just to keep the fragile ecosystem of our house intact. I was trained to fold under pressure. I was taught that apologizing for things I did not do was the currency required to buy my family's love. Standing on the balcony, the urge to revert to that terrified 15-year-old girl was nearly overwhelming. The threat of criminal charges was a heavy, suffocating weight. If my father walked into a police precinct on Monday morning and handed a detective those forged bank ledgers, my life would implode. The state attorney would issue an arrest warrant. My mugshot would be published in the local county arrest logs. The state licensing board would immediately suspend my appraisal credentials pending an investigation. Even if I eventually proved my innocence in a courtroom a year from now, the immediate collateral damage would be permanent. Diego Suarez canceling my contract would be just the beginning. I would be destitute, fighting a federal indictment from a jail cell. Antrosaurus text was a preemptive strike. David Klein had warned me this exact scenario would unfold. When David pulled the state tax records for Suncoast Holdings, the digital tripwire alerted my father's corporate registered agent. Hector knew the corporate veil had been pierced. He knew someone was looking directly at the swampland deeds and the counterfeit notary stamps. The cornered predators realized the scapegoat had stopped running and started hunting. They were accelerating the timeline, using the sheer terror of a police investigation to force my immediate compliance. They wanted to break me before the weekend was over. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the humid air. I visualized the layout of Aunt Rosaurus' living room. I pictured Hector and Patricia sitting on the sofa, wearing their masks of manufactured grief. I pictured the aunts and uncles whispering, casting their judgments without a single shred of actual evidence. They expected me to walk into that house, fall to my knees, and beg for their mercy. They expected me to sign the non-disclosure agreement, take the meager bribe, and disappear into the shadows so they could maintain their pristine country club illusion. I let go of the metal railing and turned back toward the interior of my condo. The sliding glass door shut behind me, muting the sounds of the city traffic. I walked into the kitchen and stood before the large quartz island. Resting in the exact center of the counter was a thick, black leather binder. David Klein had delivered the finalized physical copy of his forensic report by courier an hour before my meeting with Ashley. It was a dense, heavy collection of paper, neatly organized with colored tabs and laminated dividers. It looked like a standard corporate portfolio, but it was actually a meticulously constructed explosive device. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the smooth leather cover. The tactile sensation grounded me, pulling me away from the emotional quicksand of my childhood conditioning. I opened the binder, flipping past the title page. The crisp white sheets contained the undeniable anatomy of a financial crime. Here were the Suncoast Cooperative Banking statements, highlighting the structured wire transfers designed to evade federal reporting thresholds. Here was the Delaware Registry, proving the holding company was a deliberate shield. Here was the public deed for the Everglades swampland, featuring the zoomed-in, high-resolution photograph of my father's counterfeit notary seal, the missing letter staring back at me like a glaring confession. And here was the state tax document, listing Hector, Patricia, and Brandon as the sole beneficial owners of the entity that swallowed my grandmother's legacy. The fear that had gripped my chest on the balcony began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp, and precise clarity. My parents were threatening me with an illusion. They were relying on intimidation and forged documents to maintain their power. But I was holding the bedrock. I was holding empirical, documented truth. Truth does not care about family hierarchies. Truth does not care about vintage diamond tennis bracelets or luxury sports cars. I was no longer the 15-year-old girl willing to take the blame for a dented bumper. I was a licensed professional who evaluated worth for a living. I knew exactly what my family was made of, and their structural integrity was compromised beyond repair. I picked up my phone from the counter. The screen illuminated, displaying Aunt Resor's ultimatum. I tapped the reply field, my thumbs hovering over the digital keyboard. I did not type a defense. I did not ask for a private conversation. I chose my words with surgical precision, ensuring my response conveyed exactly the right tone of calm, unshakable authority. "I will be there," I typed. "And I am bringing a guest." I hit send. The message bubble turned blue and shot across the screen, a digital arrow fired directly into the heart of their strategy. The silence in the apartment felt different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of isolation. It was the quiet calm before a hurricane makes landfall. I dialed David Klein's number. He answered with his usual brisk efficiency. "The family tribunal is set for Sunday evening at my aunt's house in Coral Gables," I informed him, my voice projecting a steady, even tenor. "My father is threatening to file the criminal complaint on Monday morning. They are trying to force a surrender." "I will clear my schedule for Sunday," David replied smoothly, the sound of a closing file cabinet echoing in the background. "I assume you want me to present the forensic findings directly to the audience. I want you to lay the numbers out on the coffee table so every single relative can see the math," I confirmed. "There is one more thing, Lauren," David said, his tone shifting, losing a fraction of its clinical detachment. The hesitation in his voice caught my immediate attention. While compiling the final financial exhibits, I sent a paralegal down to the county courthouse to pull the original probate filings for the estate. I was looking for any secondary trust amendments. I found something buried in the county archives. It is a document your grandmother filed directly with the surrogate court just weeks before she passed away. "What kind of document?" I asked, my pulse quickening at the mention of Abuela Rosa. "It is a handwritten addendum," David explained. "She did not just assign you as the beneficiary. She wrote a letter explaining exactly why she structured the trust the way she did. You need to read this before you walk into that house on Sunday. It changes the entire context of the theft." A tight knot formed in my throat. "Send it to my secure email," I instructed. I hung up the phone, staring at the black binder on the counter. The puzzle was nearly complete. My parents had stolen the money, but my grandmother had left behind a final, hidden message. The battle lines were drawn, and the ultimate truth was finally coming to the surface. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The notification icon pulsed in the upper right corner, signaling an incoming encrypted file from David Klein. My hands felt unusually heavy as I maneuvered the cursor over the digital envelope. The subject line simply read, "Probate Addendum Document." I clicked the mouse, and the PDF generated on my screen. It was a scanned copy of a handwritten letter bearing the official watermark of the Miami-Dade County Surrogate Court. The date stamped across the top was exactly 3 weeks before Abuela Rosa passed away. The penmanship was unmistakable. The slanted, elegant cursive brought a sudden, sharp ache to the back of my throat. I could almost smell the faint scent of orange blossoms and old paper that always accompanied her. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the digital ink with my eyes, absorbing the final words my grandmother ever submitted to the public record. To the Honorable Judge of the Probate Court, the letter began. I submit this addendum to my final will and testament to ensure my exact intentions are preserved, shielding my estate from any future familial disputes or misinterpretations. I took a slow breath, the air catching in my chest. Abuela Rosa knew. She knew the moment her heart stopped, the vultures would begin to circle. I leave the entirety of my liquid assets, totaling $450,000, exclusively to my granddaughter Lauren Rodriguez. This decision is not born out of unequal love for my descendants, but out of absolute necessity. I have spent my life cultivating the earth, planting citrus groves, and understanding the value of roots. My son Hector does not understand roots. He understands only the illusion of altitude. The words leaped off the glowing screen, striking me with the force of a physical blow. She had seen right through my father. While Hector paraded around the Riviera Country Club, boasting about his real estate empire and flashing his counterfeit wealth, his own mother sat quietly in her modest home, observing the terminal rot spreading through his foundation. Hector has spent decades building unstable structures, the letter continued. He leverages tomorrow to pay for today, adopting terrible financial risks to maintain a hollow social standing. I have watched him remortgage his stability to fund his arrogance. If I leave my life savings to him, or to my grandson Brandon, the capital will evaporate in a matter of months, swallowed by their endless debts and reckless ventures. They will squander my legacy to buy another year of pretending they are kings. A single tear broke free, tracing a hot path down my cheek and splashing onto the keyboard. It was not a tear of grief or terror. It was the purest form of validation I had ever experienced in my 30 years on this earth. My entire childhood, I felt like the outsider, the ungrateful daughter who refused to participate in the family pageant. I thought my independence was a disappointment to them. I thought I was defective because I could not smile and ignore the glaring structural flaws in our household. But Abuela Rosa had seen me. She had watched me work 2 jobs to pay my college tuition while Brandon crashed leased sports cars. She watched me study late into the night to earn my appraisal license, building a career based on demanding the empirical truth. Lauren is different, my grandmother wrote in the final concluding paragraph. She possesses a rare and unyielding moral compass. She seeks the actual value of things, refusing to be blinded by a fresh coat of paint. She builds her life on bedrock. I entrust my legacy to her because she is the only person in this bloodline with the strength to protect it. She will not bend to intimidation, and she will not sacrifice her integrity for convenience. Let this document serve as my final command. Protect Lauren from her father. I pushed the laptop away, covering my face with both hands. Sobs racked my chest, fierce and releasing. The profound isolation that had suffocated me since the Sunday barbecue finally broke apart. I was never alone. Even from the grave, the strongest woman I ever knew reached across time to shield me. She armed me with the ultimate truth. The psychological shift inside my brain was seismic. An hour ago, I was operating on defense. I was a terrified woman gathering evidence to keep myself out of a federal penitentiary. I was fighting to clear my name, to salvage my career, and to escape the crushing weight of my parents' false accusations. That scared girl vanished, replaced by an executioner. This money was never just a trust fund. It was a sacred inheritance, forged through decades of sun-blistered labor in the Florida dirt. Hector and Patricia did not just commit wire fraud. They violated a dying woman's final wish. They stole the bedrock to pave their swamp. They weaponized their own daughter, attempting to destroy the exact person Abuela Rosa trusted to break the cycle of generational deceit. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my vision clearing. I stood up from the kitchen island, feeling a cold, unbreakable resolve settle into my bones. The fear of Aunt Rosaura's tribunal evaporated. The anxiety about facing dozens of judging relatives vanished. I wanted them all in that room. I wanted the entire extended family to sit on those plush leather sofas and witness the exact moment the Rodriguez facade imploded. I was going to burn their country club illusion to the ground, and I was going to use their own arrogance as the accelerant. My phone vibrated against the quartz countertop. I picked it up, my hand entirely steady. It was David Klein. "Did you read the addendum?" he asked, his voice crisp and focused. "I read it," I replied, my tone matching his clinical precision. "It is the final piece of the puzzle. It proves motive, and it strips away any defense my father might try to mount regarding a misunderstanding of the will." "It is a devastating document," David agreed. "It provides the moral narrative that juries and judges look for in complex financial litigation. But that is not why I am calling you right now." I frowned, walking toward the window to look out at the darkening city skyline. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long pools of amber light across the pavement. "What is it?" I inquired. "I am finishing the compilation of the presentation binders for tomorrow night," David explained, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the receiver. "I needed to ensure the timeline of your father's underwater Everglades investment perfectly matched the date of the wire transfers. To do that, I had to pull the original mortgage records for the commercial swampland he purchased 3 years ago. I needed to see exactly how much debt the private lender was calling in. And the numbers matched, I assumed, tracing the cool glass of the window pane with my index finger. They matched, David confirmed. But Lauren, the $450,000 he stole from your trust was not enough to cover his entire margin call. Your father was facing a catastrophic default. The private lender demanded a seven-figure sum to stop the foreclosure on the commercial parcel. I stopped moving. The rhythmic hum of my air conditioning suddenly sounded incredibly loud in the quiet apartment. If the stolen trust fund was not enough to satisfy the debt, how did he avoid bankruptcy? I asked, a new sense of dread prickling the back of my neck. "He secured a secondary loan," David said softly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "A high-interest bridge loan from a different financial institution. But because his credit was already ruined, he needed significant collateral to secure the capital. Collateral he did not actually own." "What did he leverage?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "I am looking at the secondary mortgage filing right now," David replied, pausing for a fraction of a second. "He forged another signature using that counterfeit notary stamp. He quietly leveraged Aunt Rosaura's Coral Gables estate." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. My father had not just sacrificed me. He had infected the entire bloodline. The family tribunal scheduled for tomorrow was taking place inside a house that my father had secretly mortgaged to the hilt, and the debt was currently in default. The trap I was walking into was infinitely more explosive than I ever imagined. The silence following David Klein's revelation was absolute. I stood motionless by the window, the amber glow of the city lights blurring into long streaks across the glass. The air in my condo felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been suddenly siphoned out of the room. My mind raced, struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "Are you absolutely certain?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, jagged against my throat. David cleared his throat, the sound sharp over the speakerphone. "I am looking at the secondary mortgage filing right now, Lauren," he repeated, his tone devoid of any comforting warmth. The document bears the same counterfeit notary stamp your father used for the swampland deed. He forged Rosora's signature. He placed a secondary lien on her Coral Gables property to secure a high-interest bridge loan. And based on the payment schedule, he is currently 90 days past due. The lender has likely already initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. Hector Rodriguez had not just sacrificed his daughter to save his social standing. He had infected the entire bloodline. For decades, Aunt Rosora had been his most loyal defender. She was the matriarch who hosted the holiday dinners, the woman who bailed him out of minor financial scrapes in his 20s, the sister who trusted him implicitly with her real estate portfolio. And he had rewarded that loyalty by secretly pledging the roof over her head to cover his catastrophic Everglades gamble. The $450,000 he stole from Abuela Rosa's trust was just a drop in the bucket. It was merely the initial down payment to temporarily stall the margin call. The rot went so much deeper than I ever imagined. My father had weaponized the entire extended family against me, orchestrating the public ambush at the barbecue and summoning me to a tribunal in a house he had secretly leveraged and was currently losing. "David," I said, forcing my pulse into a slower, more deliberate rhythm. "I need physical copies of that secondary mortgage filing. I need the forged signature highlighted, and I need the default notices included in the final binders." "They are already being printed," David assured me, the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard resuming. "I will have the complete portfolios assembled and indexed by noon tomorrow. I will meet you outside the Coral Gables estate at 5 o'clock. I disconnected the call and placed my phone gently on the quartz countertop. The fear that had gripped me earlier in the evening was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was an appraiser. My entire career was built on evaluating distressed properties, identifying structural failure, and exposing hidden liabilities. Tomorrow, I was going to appraise the Rodriguez family. The next 24 hours stretched with agonizing slowness. I did not sleep. I spent the night pacing my hardwood floors, reviewing the sequence of events, memorizing the dates of the wire transfers, and internalizing the exact phrasing of Abuela Rosa's letter. I rehearsed the presentation, ensuring every word I planned to speak would carry the surgical precision of a scalpel. I was not going to yell. I was not going to cry. Emotional outbursts were my mother's currency. I traded exclusively in undeniable facts. Sunday afternoon arrived, bringing with it a stifling blanket of humidity. I dressed carefully, selecting a tailored navy blazer and dark trousers. It was the armor I wore when delivering brutal valuations to combative developers. I needed to project absolute authority. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of my condo, the heavy wooden door shutting with a decisive click behind me. The drive to Coral Gables was surreal. The palm trees swayed in the gentle ocean breeze, the coastal mansions gleamed under the bright afternoon sun, and luxury vehicles cruised smoothly along the coastal highway. It was the picture-perfect illusion of Miami success. But I knew the dirty secrets hiding behind the pristine stucco walls. I arrived 10 minutes early and parked my sedan across the street from Aunt Rosora's sprawling Mediterranean estate. The circular driveway was already packed with cars. My cousins' imported sedans, my uncle's rugged SUVs, and my father's sleek, leased luxury vehicle were all lined up, a fleet of witnesses summoned for my execution. A sleek black town car pulled up directly behind me. David Klein stepped out, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. He walked over to my car, his expression unreadable behind a pair of dark aviator sunglasses. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady and professional. I looked at the heavy oak front door of the estate, the house my father had secretly mortgaged to the hilt, the house where my mother planned to play the victim one last time. "I am ready," I replied, stepping out onto the pavement. "Let us show them the math." We walked up the brick pathway together, the sound of our footsteps synchronized and purposeful. The front door was unlocked, a silent invitation to the tribunal. I pushed the heavy wood open and stepped into the grand foyer. The sudden blast of air conditioning chilled the sweat on my neck. The ambient noise of 30 relatives murmuring in the sunken living room ceased instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I walked down the 2 shallow steps into the main gathering area, David trailing slightly behind me. The seating arrangements were exactly as I anticipated. Hector and Patricia occupied the center leather sofa, holding hands, projecting a united front of sorrowful martyrdom. Brandon sat rigidly in a wingback chair in the corner, his eyes fixed on the floor, while Ashley stood behind him, her hands resting tightly on his shoulders, enforcing the muzzle I had demanded. Aunt Razora stood near the massive stone fireplace, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She looked at me, her face hardened with judgment. Then her eyes flicked to David, a flicker of confusion breaking her hostile stare. "Lauren," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any familial warmth, "you were summoned here to answer to your parents. Who is this man, and why is he standing in my home?" I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I walked directly to the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from my parents. "This is David Klein," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "He is a private forensic accountant. You summoned me here to explain the disappearance of Abuela Rosa's trust fund. I brought him to provide the exact documented answer." Patricia let out a dramatic, breathy gasp, pressing a manicured hand against her chest. "Lauren, please," she pleaded, her eyes shining with manufactured tears. "Do not do this. We gave you a chance to handle this privately. We offered you a settlement. Why are you dragging a stranger into our family tragedy?" Hector tightened his grip on her hand, his face darkening with anger. "This is inappropriate," he declared, attempting to assert his patriarchal authority. "This is a private family matter. We have the bank ledgers. We know what you did. If you will not confess and accept responsibility right now, I will call the police and hand them the evidence myself." I looked at my father, studying the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands. He was terrified. He knew the net was closing, and he was trying to bluster his way out of the trap. "I agree we need the truth, Dad," I said calmly, maintaining steady eye contact. "I agree we need to look at the ledgers, but we are not going to look at your forged documents. We are going to look at the actual receipts." I turned slightly, gesturing for David to step forward. He unlatched the heavy leather briefcase, the metallic click echoing loudly in the tense silence of the living room. He pulled out a stack of thick black binders, each one neatly organized with colored tabs. He began passing them around the room, handing one to Aunt Rosora, one to my oldest uncle, and sliding one directly onto the coffee table in front of my parents. The room held its collective breath. The aunts and uncles hesitated, staring at the black leather covers as if they were live explosives. Patricia stared at the binder on the table, her face draining of all color. Hector did not move. "Open them," I instructed, my voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "The story you have been told over the past 2 weeks is a lie. Inside those binders is the empirical anatomy of a federal crime. It is time to appraise the true value of this family." Sunday arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that felt almost cinematic. The Florida sun beat down on the pavement, radiating in shimmering waves across the asphalt. I drove toward Coral Gables with the air conditioning blasting, yet my hands remained perfectly steady on the leather steering wheel. The paralyzing terror that had gripped me just 24 hours ago was entirely gone. It had burned away, leaving behind a cold, clinical focus. I was no longer a daughter arriving to seek forgiveness. I was a licensed professional arriving to conduct a structural demolition. I parked my rental car across the street from Aunt Rosora's sprawling Mediterranean estate. The circular driveway was already filled to capacity. I recognized the fleet of expensive vehicles immediately. There was Uncle Carlos' imported sedan. There was Cousin Elena's pristine white SUV. And parked near the front entrance, gleaming under the afternoon sun, was my father's leased luxury car. Nearly 30 relatives had gathered inside. They had cleared their weekend schedules, eager to witness the public execution of the family scapegoat. A sleek black town car glided to a halt right behind my vehicle. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. David Klein emerged wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. He reached back inside and retrieved a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase. He adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable behind a pair of dark aviator sunglasses, and walked over to where I stood on the sidewalk. "Are you prepared for the psychological pressure?" he asked, his voice steady and devoid of any emotional inflection. I looked at the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. "I have spent my entire life preparing for this," I replied. "Let us go inside." We walked up the wide brick pathway together. The sound of our synchronized footsteps echoed against the manicured hedges. The heavy oak front door stood slightly ajar, a silent, arrogant invitation. I pushed the polished wood open and stepped into the grand foyer. The sudden blast of refrigerated air chilled the faint layer of sweat on my neck. The ambient noise of 36 relatives murmuring in the sunken living room was a low, steady hum of gossip and judgment. The moment my shoes clicked against the imported Spanish tile, the conversation died. The silence that swept through the house was sudden and suffocating. It was not a respectful quiet. It was the heavy, loaded stillness of a courtroom waiting for the defendant to take the stand. I walked slowly down the 2 shallow steps into the main gathering area, David trailing a deliberate half-pace behind me. The seating arrangements were orchestrated with theatrical precision. My parents occupied the plush leather sofa in the exact center of the room. Hector and Patricia sat shoulder to shoulder, their hands tightly intertwined, projecting a united front of tragic martyrdom. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a folded tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch forced to punish her own child. My father sat with his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead, wearing a mask of stern, patriarchal disappointment. I let my gaze sweep past them to the far corner of the room. Brandon sat rigidly in a high-backed wing chair. Normally, my older brother would be pacing the floor, projecting his loud, charismatic authority and controlling the narrative. Today, he was a statue. He stared blankly at the Persian rug, his face drained of color. Standing directly behind him was his wife. Ashley rested both of her hands on his shoulders. Her knuckles were white. Her fingernails dug visibly into the fabric of his expensive linen jacket. It was a physical restraint. She had delivered the threat I gave her at the coffee shop, and she was ensuring her husband did not speak a single word that might jeopardize her boutique fitness center. The golden boy was fully neutralized. Aunt Rosora stood near the vast stone fireplace, acting as the presiding judge of this tribunal. She wore a tailored pantsuit and heavy gold jewelry that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. She was the anchor of this family, the woman who believed she commanded unquestioned respect. I looked at her, studying the proud tilt of her chin, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity. She had no idea that the man sitting on her sofa had secretly mortgaged the very roof over her head to cover his own failures. She was standing in a house she was about to lose. Rosora took a deliberate step forward, crossing her arms over her chest. Her eyes locked onto mine, devoid of the warmth she used to offer me during my childhood. "Lauren," she began, her voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "You were summoned here to answer for your actions. Your parents have endured enough pain this month. We gathered the family today to give you one final opportunity. This is your last chance to confess. If you admit to what you did and sign the settlement agreement your mother offered, we will handle this internally. If you refuse, Your father will leave this house and drive directly to the police precinct." She paused, letting the heavy threat hang in the chilled air. Then her gaze flicked to the man standing behind me. A flicker of genuine confusion broke her hostile stare. "Who is this man?" she demanded, her tone sharpening with suspicion. "And why did you bring a stranger into my home during a private family crisis?" I did not flinch. I did not avert my eyes. The 15-year-old girl who used to take the blame for dented bumpers and broken vases was dead. I felt the profound, unyielding strength of Abuela Rosa's letter anchoring my spine. I turned my back on my parents and walked deliberately toward the massive formal dining table positioned at the edge of the living room. It was a long, polished mahogany surface meant for holiday feasts. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair at the very head of the table and sat down. It was the seat traditionally reserved for my father. Several aunts gasped at the sheer audacity of the gesture. "This is David Klein," I announced, projecting my voice so it reached every corner of the room. "He is a private forensic accountant. You summoned me here today because you wanted an explanation regarding the disappearance of Abuela Rosa's trust fund. You demanded a confession. I brought him to provide the exact documented answer." Patricia let out a dramatic, breathy sigh, pressing the tissue against her collarbone. "Lauren, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling with engineered sorrow. "Do not make this worse. We gave you a clean exit. Why are you dragging a stranger into our family tragedy? We have the bank ledgers. We know what happened." Hector leaned forward, his face darkening with a sudden rush of panic. He recognized the leather briefcase in David's hand. He recognized the calm, systematic threat of an auditor. "This is highly inappropriate," my father declared, attempting to assert his crumbling authority. "We are not conducting a corporate review. This is a family matter. If you will not accept responsibility right now, I am ending this meeting and calling the authorities myself." I looked at my father. I studied the sweat gathering at his temples, the subtle tremor in his hands, and the desperate, cornered glint in his eyes. He was terrified. He knew his counterfeit notary stamp could not withstand professional scrutiny, and he was trying to bluster his way out of the snare before it pulled tight. "I agree we need the truth, Dad," I said, maintaining steady, unblinking eye contact. "I agree we need to look at the ledgers, but we are not going to look at your forged documents." I turned my head slightly, gesturing for David to step forward. He placed the reinforced briefcase flat on the polished mahogany table. The metallic snap of the latches echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. He opened the lid and began pulling out the thick, black binders. He moved with swift, methodical precision. He handed one binder to Aunt Rosora. He handed another to my oldest uncle. He walked over to the leather sofa and placed the final, heaviest binder directly on the glass coffee table in front of my parents. The relatives stared at the black leather covers. Nobody moved. They looked at the documents as if they were live explosives. Patricia stared at the binder on the coffee table, her lips parting in silent horror. Hector remained frozen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his own knees. "Open them," I instructed, my voice cutting through the thick atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. "The story you have been told over the past 2 weeks is a carefully constructed lie. Inside those pages is the empirical anatomy of a federal crime. Let us look at the receipts." David reached out and tapped the thick cover of the binder resting on the glass coffee table in front of my parents. "I recommend you turn to page 4, he stated. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that sliced cleanly through the stifling tension of the living room. It outlines the chronological sequence of the wire fraud. Every relative in the room possessing a copy slowly opened the heavy leather cover. The crisp rustle of high-quality paper echoed like a warning bell across the Spanish tile. I watched my father. Hector stared at the closed binder on his table, his jaw muscles ticking rapidly. His hands were locked into white-knuckled fists resting on his knees. He refused to look at the documents. My grandmother left her estate solely to me, I explained, keeping my tone entirely conversational as I addressed the crowded room. The money was intended to bypass my father's historic financial instability. Turn to page 7. You will see a standard banking application for an account at Suncoast Cooperative. The name listed at the top is mine. The signature at the bottom is a blatant forgery. My mother walked into that specific branch because her oldest friend, Carmen Delgado, is the manager. Patricia convinced Carmen to bypass federal identity verification laws, claiming she was establishing a surprise fund for my future. Carmen authorized the account creation without my physical presence or my signature. Aunt Rosora frowned, tracing the printed text of the banking application with a manicured finger. Patricia shifted uncomfortably on the plush leather sofa. Her engineered sorrow faltered as the cold, hard facts laid themselves bare in front of her peers. That account was merely a temporary funnel, David interjected smoothly, seamlessly picking up the narrative. The stolen capital did not remain at the credit union for more than 72 hours. It was layered through intermediary accounts and ultimately deposited into a Delaware limited liability company called Suncoast Holdings. Turn to the blue tab. You will find the official state tax filings for that specific corporate entity. The registry clearly lists the beneficial owners. 50% belongs to Brandon Rodriguez. The remaining 50% belongs jointly to Hector and Patricia Rodriguez. A collective murmur rippled through the gathering. Dozens of eyes snapped from the documents toward the center sofa. My oldest uncle flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in deep concentration as he absorbed the magnitude of the deceit. Brandon remained completely silent in his wingback chair. Ashley tightened her grip on his shoulders, a physical reminder of the threat I issued at the coffee shop. She knew her boutique fitness center was operating on that stolen money, and she was prioritizing her own survival over my brother's pride. Hector finally looked up, his face a mottled shade of red. He struggled to assemble a coherent defense. "This is manipulated data," he argued weakly, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. "Anyone can print fake tax forms from the internet to frame someone else." I expected the denial. I welcomed it. I turned to page 12 in my own portfolio. "Let us talk about where the cash actually went," I suggested, directing my gaze precisely at my mother's wrist. Turn to the yellow tab. It details the outbound transactions from Suncoast Holdings. Most of the capital was diverted to pay down toxic commercial real estate debts. However, my parents siphoned a portion for personal enrichment. Look at the ledger entry dated October 22nd. A wire transfer for exactly $12,500 was sent directly to a boutique luxury jeweler in the Miami Design District. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. I looked directly at Patricia. My mother instinctively reached across her body, her right hand attempting to cover her left wrist. "Take a close look at the diamond tennis bracelet she is wearing right now," I instructed the room. The vintage piece she paraded around the barbecue last week, claiming it was an early anniversary present from her devoted husband. She bought those diamonds with my grandmother's stolen legacy. The original jewelry store receipt matching the exact wire transfer amount is located on page 13. A sharp gasp erupted from Cousin Elena. Aunt Rosora lowered her binder, her eyes locking onto Patricia's wrist. The undeniable proof shattered the illusion of the wealthy, benevolent matriarch. Patricia tried to tuck her arm behind her back, but the frantic movement only confirmed her guilt. The performative tears she had cried minutes ago vanished, replaced by a genuine, stark panic. She was exposed, stripped of her country club armor, sitting bare before the harsh judgment of her own siblings. But a stolen inheritance and a diamond bracelet were merely the superficial wounds. It was time to deliver the lethal blow. I turned to address the woman standing by the massive stone fireplace. "Aunt Rosora," I said, softening my voice just a fraction. "You hosted this gathering today to force my surrender. You believed you were defending the integrity of the family against a greedy niece. I need you to turn to the final red tab in your portfolio. I need you to look at what your brother truly thinks of your loyalty. Rosora flipped to the back of the binder. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon of the commercial property records. 3 years ago, I explained, Hector made a catastrophic, highly leveraged investment in raw swampland bordering the Everglades. He bet everything on a municipal rezoning project that failed. The private lender called the margin. He needed a seven-figure sum to stop the immediate foreclosure. Abuela Rosa's trust fund was only a small down payment. He needed significant collateral to secure a secondary high-interest bridge loan to save himself from total bankruptcy. Rosora went entirely still. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged in the bright chandelier light. You will notice the secondary mortgage filing, David added, his clinical tone emphasizing the profound gravity of the document. Hector utilized the exact same counterfeit notary stamp he used to dodge property taxes a decade ago. He forged your signature, Rosora. He placed a secondary lien against this very house. He leveraged your Coral Gables estate to secure his bridge loan. I watched my aunt's hands begin to tremble. The heavy gold jewelry on her wrists clinked together, betraying her physical shock. He is currently 90 days past due on the repayment schedule, I informed her, delivering the final devastating arithmetic. The private lender has already initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. By trying to ruin me to save his own facade, Hector put your wealth at risk. You are going to lose your home because you trusted your brother. The living room erupted into utter chaos. It was instantaneous and explosive. Rosora dropped the black binder onto the floor. The heavy object hit the Spanish tile with a loud, resounding thud. She stepped forward, her face contorted with a mixture of raw grief and blinding rage. "You stole my house?" she screamed at Hector, her voice cracking under the severe emotional strain. "I protected you my entire life, and you forged my name to save your swamp." Hector shrank back against the sofa cushions, throwing his hands up in a futile gesture of defense. "Rosora, please," he stammered, his patriarchal authority completely incinerated. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed a little more time. The rezoning permit is still under appeal." Patricia finally broke. The calculated, manipulative sobbing she had practiced for decades transformed into genuine, visceral wailing. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as the reality of their total social and financial destruction crashed down upon her. The aunts and uncles began shouting, a chaotic chorus of betrayal and shock echoing off the high ceilings of the estate. Relatives turned on each other, demanding answers, expressing their disgust, and distancing themselves from the center sofa. I remained seated at the head of the mahogany dining table, entirely untouched by the storm raging around me. The noise washed over me, loud and punishing, but it could not breach my calm. I had appraised their foundation, exposed the rot, and watched the structure collapse exactly as the math predicted. I reached into my leather handbag one final time. I pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy blazer. I walked slowly toward the glass coffee table, navigating through the yelling relatives and the scattered pages of evidence. I stopped directly in front of my father. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic fear. The man who had chased me out of his yard just a week ago was now begging silently for mercy. I placed the paper face up on the glass surface and slid it toward him. It was an official Internal Revenue Service whistleblower informant document, Form 211. It was completely filled out, detailing the systemic tax evasion, the fraudulent shell company, and the repeated use of counterfeit notary stamps across multiple county filings. A bold red certified mail receipt was stapled to the top left corner. "I already mailed it," I told him, keeping my voice low enough that only he and my mother could hear it over the screaming room. You wanted to call the authorities on me this Monday. I decided to save you the trip. The federal government does not care about your country club memberships or your apologies. They only care about the math. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy oak front door. David Klein fell into step beside me, his briefcase secured in his grip. Behind us, the Rodriguez family tore itself apart, the illusion of their perfection forever shattered by the undeniable weight of the receipts. My work here was done. The execution was complete, leaving only the inevitable legal fallout to sweep through the wreckage. The living room of the Coral Gables estate dissolved into a cacophony of shattered illusions. Aunts and uncles turned on each other, their voices rising in a frantic bid to distance themselves from the blast radius of my parents' fraud. I stood by the glass coffee table, observing the wreckage I had engineered. I felt no guilt. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. Hector looked up from the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower form. His face was a pale, defeated mask. The patriarchal authority he had wielded like a weapon my entire life had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a man. His hands trembled against his knees. "You destroyed this family," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his impending ruin. I looked down at him, my posture straight, my expression devoid of any lingering childhood fear. "No, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I just appraised its true value." I turned my back on the center sofa and walked toward the heavy oak front door. I did not rush. I took measured, deliberate steps across the imported Spanish tile, moving past the relatives who had gathered to witness my execution. They parted to let me through, their eyes wide with shock and newfound terror. They finally understood that the girl they had spent decades dismissing was the only one holding the structural blueprints. David Klein matched my pace, his reinforced leather briefcase secured firmly in his grip. We exited the house together, stepping out into the warm, humid embrace of the Miami night. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, severing the chaotic noise of the tribunal. The sudden quiet of the circular driveway felt like stepping onto a different planet. The night air smelled of salt and blooming jasmine. I walked to my rental car and unlocked the doors. As I slid into the driver's seat, my phone illuminated in the cup holder. The screen filled with rapid-fire notifications. Text messages poured in from cousins who had stood silently by while my mother accused me of a felony. They were suddenly eager to apologize, desperate to align themselves with the victor, begging me to answer their calls and explain the details. I picked up the device, my thumb hovering over the screen. I did not read their excuses. I navigated to the settings menu and initiated a factory reset. The screen went dark, erasing their phone numbers, their group chats, and their toxic history from my life. I dropped the blank piece of glass into the passenger seat, shifted the car into drive, and pulled away from the estate. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. The fallout from that Sunday evening did not happen overnight. Federal investigations operate with a slow, grinding certainty. The Internal Revenue Service received my documented submission by the end of the week. Armed with the counterfeit notary stamps, the Delaware corporate registry, and the fraudulent banking records, federal agents initiated a comprehensive audit of Hector and Patricia Rodriguez. The state attorney followed suit, opening a criminal inquiry into the identity theft and the forged signatures. The social execution my parents had planned for me rebounded onto them with devastating precision. The Miami luxury real estate network is built on whispers, and the truth traveled much faster than their initial lie. The Riviera Country Club quietly revoked their membership privileges. The private lenders, sensing the impending federal freeze, accelerated their collection efforts. The illusion of their wealth unraveled in a spectacular public collapse. Aunt Rosora lost her sprawling Mediterranean estate. The secondary bridge loan my father secured using her forged signature defaulted. because she had unknowingly allowed her property to be used as collateral for a commercial gamble. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. She was forced to pack up her crystal wine glasses and her imported rugs, moving into a modest apartment in Kendall. Her blind loyalty to a rotten foundation had cost her the roof over her head. For me, the ensuing months were a period of quiet, methodical reconstruction. The restoration of my professional reputation required patience, but the market rewards undeniable competence. When Diego Suarez, the international developer who had canceled my $20 million hotel contract, learned the actual details of the family fraud, he personally called my office. He did not offer an apology, which I respected. Instead, he offered me a new, more lucrative commercial valuation project in South Beach. I rebuilt my client roster, brick by brick, ensuring every professional relationship was anchored in transparency and hard data. 6 months after the tribunal, the oppressive summer heat gave way to a crisp, clear Florida winter. I was sitting at my desk in my newly leased Fort Lauderdale office, reviewing a stack of municipal zoning permits, when an email arrived from the asset management division of a major regional bank. They required an independent appraiser to conduct a pre-auction valuation on a distressed commercial property located in Coral Gables. The bank was preparing to liquidate the asset following a protracted bankruptcy proceeding. I opened the attached PDF to review the property details. The address listed was a familiar storefront in a premium zip code. It was the exact location of Brandon's boutique fitness center. The Golden Boy had not survived the financial freeze. When the authorities zeroed in on Suncoast Holdings, the dirty capital keeping his business afloat evaporated. Without the stolen trust fund to cover his exorbitant commercial lease and his imported exercise equipment, the gym suffocated within weeks. Ashley had indeed filed for divorce, taking whatever assets she could untangle before the government stepped in, leaving Brandon to face the creditors alone. I accepted the appraisal contract. The following Tuesday, I drove my newly purchased vehicle down the tree-lined streets of Coral Gables. I parked against the curb, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. I carried a standard aluminum clipboard, a laser distance measurer, and a digital camera. The glass-fronted building looked entirely different from the day I had confronted my brother. The neon sign was dead, the colorful tubing cracked and dull. A heavy steel padlock secured the main double doors. A stark white foreclosure notice was taped to the interior glass, bearing the official seal of the county court. A bank representative met me on the sidewalk, handed me a set of heavy brass keys, and allowed me to enter the premises. The interior of the fitness center was a cavernous, dusty shell of failed ambition. The pristine rows of treadmills and weight racks were gone, repossessed by the equipment leasing company months ago. The custom mirrors lining the walls reflected only empty space and exposed concrete floors. The air smelled stale, lacking the vibrant, energetic pulse of a functioning enterprise. I walked slowly through the deserted studio, my shoes echoing loudly against the bare floorboards. I noted the scuff marks on the baseboards, the missing ceiling tiles, and the cheap, superficial drywall Brandon had installed to create the illusion of a luxury locker room. I lifted my digital camera, documenting the raw, unvarnished state of the property. I took measurements, calculating the square footage, assessing the exact market value of the empty square box. I reached the back office, the room where Brandon had likely sat, pretending to be a titan of industry while burning through our grandmother's legacy. The desk was gone. The filing cabinets were empty. A single, forgotten promotional flyer lay face down on the dusty carpet. I picked it up, noting the sleek logo and the empty promises printed on the glossy paper. He had tried to build an empire on stolen sand. He had tried to leverage my freedom to finance his facade. Now, he had nothing. His luxury sports car was impounded. His marriage was dissolved. His reputation was ruined. He was left holding the empty bag his parents had handed him. I lowered my clipboard, looking out through the smudged floor to ceiling windows at the busy Coral Gables street. I did not feel a sense of vengeful triumph. Revenge is a chaotic, unpredictable emotion. What I felt was the quiet, steady satisfaction of universal equilibrium. The math had finally balanced. The debts were paid. I finished my inspection, locking the heavy steel padlock behind me as I stepped back out into the fresh Florida air. I handed the keys back to the bank representative, signed the chain of custody form, and walked back to my car. I placed my clipboard on the passenger seat, the preliminary numbers already organizing themselves in my mind. The property was worth a fraction of what Brandon had claimed. I would write the report, submit the valuation, and close the file. I started the engine, feeling the smooth, reliable vibration of the motor. I thought about Abuela Rosa, about the central Florida citrus groves, and the coarse dirt slipping through her calloused fingers. She had trusted me to protect the truth. She had trusted me to survive the storm. I shifted the car into drive and merged into the flowing coastal traffic. I was Lauren Rodriguez. I appraised the world for exactly what it was worth. And for the first time in my life, I was driving forward on solid, unbreakable bedrock. The story of Lauren Rodriguez is not just a tale of financial fraud or familial betrayal. It is a profound exploration of the hidden rot that can fester beneath the pristine facades we construct, particularly within the context of the American family. As I reflect on Lauren's journey, from the sweltering Miami patio where she was ambushed by those she trusted most, to the moment she appraised the worthless, foreclosed shell of her brother's gym, I am struck by the devastating consequences of prioritizing image over integrity. It forces a reckoning with our own parenting values, the nature of family responsibility, and the long-term guidance we provide to the next generation. In American culture, there is often an immense, unspoken pressure to project an image of success: the tailored suits, the imported sedans, the sprawling Mediterranean estates, and the country club memberships. Hector and Patricia Rodriguez epitomize this pursuit. They built their lives on the illusion of altitude, on the beautiful, rotting facades that masked severe damage and sinking foundations. Their parenting was not an exercise in nurturing or moral guidance, but an exercise in staging. They needed Brandon to be the golden boy, the charismatic heir apparent, regardless of his actual competence or character. And they needed Lauren to be the shock absorber, the compliant daughter who would quietly sacrifice her own stability to maintain the family's equilibrium. This dynamic is tragically common. We often confuse financial indulgence with love and parental protection with a refusal to let our children face the consequences of their actions. Hector and Patricia remortgaged their stability to fund Brandon's arrogance, shielding him from his own failures. In doing so, they did not protect him. They crippled him. They taught him that appearances are more valuable than substance, and that accountability is something to be avoided at all costs. This is the danger of raising children without emotional awareness or fairness. When parents play favorites, when they bail out the reckless child while penalizing the responsible one, they fracture the very bedrock of the family unit. Lauren, conversely, represents the antidote to this toxic dynamic. She is the embodiment of the values her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, instilled in her. The understanding that true worth is not found in the paint, but in the pillars. Lauren's career as an appraiser is a powerful metaphor. She is trained to look beneath the drywall, to spot the structural damage, and to demand empirical truth. She refuses to be blinded by the performance, whether it is a staged luxury property or her mother's calculated tears. Her resilience is not born of a lack of feeling, but of a profound commitment to reality. The contrast between Lauren and her parents highlights the critical importance of honesty in family structures. Honesty is not merely the absence of lies, it is the courage to face reality, even when it is uncomfortable or devastating. Hector and Patricia's entire existence was predicated on a lie they were willing to commit federal identity theft to protect. They sacrificed their daughter to save their facade. The tragedy is not just that they stole $450,000. It is that they were willing to destroy Lauren's reputation, her career, and her freedom, all to avoid facing the consequences of their own reckless choices. This narrative demands that we examine our own family responsibilities. Are we building our houses on sand or on bedrock? Are we teaching our children to value integrity over image? Are we fostering an environment where emotional truth is respected? Or are we demanding compliance to maintain a comfortable illusion? The story of the Rodriguez family demonstrates that a foundation built on deceit will inevitably collapse, and the collateral damage will be devastating. Furthermore, it challenges the conventional notion that family is simply a matter of blood, and that loyalty requires blind obedience. Lauren's ultimate victory is not just in exposing the fraud, but in recognizing that she does not owe her sacrifice to people who would use her as a human shield. She redefines family on her own terms, building her life on a foundation of undeniable facts and uncompromising self-respect. She learns, as we all must, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who never truly loved you. As you navigate your own relationships and parenting choices, remember the lesson of the citrus groves. Value the roots. Demand the truth. Do not be seduced by the illusion of altitude. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to spot the cracks in your own foundation, consider following QR Told Stories for more narratives that explore the complex, often messy realities of human connection. Ultimately, the most subversive act in a culture obsessed with facades is to appraise the world for exactly what it is worth. The conventional wisdom tells us that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that we must always forgive those who raised us. But perhaps true wisdom lies in understanding that sometimes the only way to save the structure is to let the rotten parts fall away. We are not obligated to drown with those who refuse to learn how to swim.